Management. If any of you are in the wrong room, now you know that. Today, our hearing is an assessment of federal recovery efforts from recent disasters. We thank all of you for being here. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearings and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now proceed with opening statements. I'll go first, and Ms. Miller, you're going to go for Mr. Meadows, I understand. All right. Well, let me say thank you to our witnesses first for joining us today as we look at these federal disaster recovery efforts and the status of them today and some of the problems that may have affected them and the challenges that they face. I don't have to tell you all that never before has the federal government had to respond to so many costly disasters all at the same time. You've had hurricanes Irma, Harvey, Maria, Michael, and Dorian causing catastrophic damage in the states and in the territories. And then just over this past weekend, the Dallas suburbs suffered widespread damage from a major tornado, and thousands across the South are cleaning up from that damage and debris left in the wake of Tropical Storm Nestor. We're here today because we're very interested in finding solutions to hasten and improve disaster recovery. The reality is that the federal government's resources are being stretched thin, some would say even exhausted, during a time when the rising cost of disasters show no sign of abating. FEMA continues to experience staffing challenges with most of its incident management workforce already deployed across the country. The agency, as I understand it, is several thousand workers short of its own estimated needs for current and future recovery efforts. During this time of recovery, focus needs to be on the communities struggling to rebuild in the wake of these disasters and preparing for what may come in the future. They need our help now more than ever. That's why we're here. Of particular concern are the territories, which have been battered by a series of disasters in recent years. The GAO published a study in July detailing the challenges of implementing the new Public Assistance National Delivery Model in Puerto Rico. So I look forward to hearing from Mr. Curry from GAO and from the Housing Secretary of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico as to how we can address those and other challenges. Although additional resources are necessary, we realize that, in order to adequately respond to mounting disasters, consideration also needs to be given to the responsibilities of all levels of government, federal, state, and local stakeholders. With so many levels of government participating in disaster recovery, coordination needs to be streamlined to ensure that survivors and communities get the assistance they need as quickly and efficiently as possible. Fortunately, we have several witnesses here with us today who can speak about their experiences with disaster recovery at the state and local levels. Finally, of particular interest to me are our most vulnerable populations, specifically how our preparation for, response to, recovery from, and mitigation of disasters can be more inclusive of seniors and persons with disabilities. I also care about efforts to rescue and provide for animals in disasters. If these topics aren't covered by some of your testimony, I'll be submitting questions to that effect for the record. I now call on the ranking member, Ms. Miller, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus. Our subcommittee's jurisdiction is expansive, covering all areas of emergency management. I want to thank the Chairwoman today for this hearing because so many communities across this nation are directly impacted by disasters and are recovering from or are still dealing with wildfires, flooding, tornadoes, and hurricanes. We have an unprecedented number of open disasters, with FEMA responding to 60% more active disasters than just a year ago. We need to continue to ensure our oversight is consistent and strong, and where there needs to be reforms, we must be willing to quickly act. Already, this Congress, our committee has acted in bipartisan fashion to pass several pieces of important disaster reform legislation. I hope that they will be enacted by the end of this year. It is critical we ensure our federal emergency management capabilities are as effective and efficient as possible. A key piece of this is recovery. The longer it takes for communities to recover, the longer it impacts people's lives, the higher the cost to the taxpayer, and the longer FEMA and other federal partners' resources are spread thin. Our goal should be to respond and get disaster assistance out the door quickly and support states and local communities in building back faster and better in order to mitigate against the next disaster. As we see more disasters, speed, efficiency, and mitigation become even more critical. We cannot afford to do this the old way, spending years or even decades to recover. We have given FEMA the tools to do that through the reforms that we passed after Sandy and more recently in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. We should be seeing recovery move faster. However, at times it seems that the red tape we take out somehow gets put back in. We have a duty to ensure disaster funding is used and spent appropriately. We also know that going back to the old way of doing things, arguing about every doorknob, how much it'll cost the taxpayer, it'll even be more money than simply by providing the states and the communities more flexibility. Let me be clear. I have a lot of respect for the men and women of FEMA. They are Americans who put their own lives on hold to be spent helping communities respond and recover from disasters. The reforms we enacted should help them to do their job faster and easier. However, despite the improvements needed in the FEMA's process, an even slower and more bureaucratic program is not represented here today. We invited HUD, given that it has received more than $37 billion since 2017 for its disaster recovery program. While I appreciate their written testimony and the briefing they provided us, our constituents need to hear publicly from them and what steps they are taking to improve their process. How do we, as the committee that oversees federal emergency management programs, do our job if one of the largest disaster programs is not represented here? I appreciate the witnesses that are here with us today, and I look forward to hearing from them on where we are in our recovery efforts and whether more reforms are needed to ensure that we are recovering faster and smarter. I yield back my time.
Thank you. I would just point out that HUD did sit down with a briefing with all of us. I don't think you were there just in the recent days to go over some of these questions that you mentioned. So we are hearing from them, and we appreciate your pointing that out. I now recognize Mr. DeFazio, the chairman of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Here we are 2 years after Harvey, Irma, Maria, and that obviously was followed by severe wildfires in the West. And these things continue ongoing. I think 80% of the members of this committee probably wouldn't be unrepresentative of members of Congress as a whole, perhaps slightly lower, represent districts with active FEMA recovery efforts underway, including a number of counties in my state because of a very extreme and unusual winter weather event last year. I can't recall the last time that FEMA was working on so many costly recoveries simultaneously. Perhaps the Associate Administrator can contradict that and say this is normal, but I'm afraid it's the new normal and not the way things have been historically. The Budget Control Act of 2011 made appropriations for FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund more predictable, and we have put up a large amount of supplemental resources on top of that. We've worked across the aisle. Disasters are not partisan in nature, and we've worked on both sides of the aisle to reform Stafford, cut red tape, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, Disaster Recovery Reform Act being the most recent bipartisan efforts. But there's more needs to be done, and that's why we're here today to figure out How can we better administer these programs for recovery, but also what more can we do for resilience, essentially prevention? Preventing a loss of life, preventing loss of infrastructure, saving, so we don't further bankrupt the federal flood insurance fund. And then was mentioned earlier, HUD is now one of the largest providers of post-disaster recovery with the CDBGDRs. I don't know what that means. Anyway, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. We put tens of billions of dollars in there. It's preferred because it's seen as something that can be move the money more quickly, but it hasn't quite worked out that way. And just last week, HUD officials told our colleagues on Appropriations Committee that they had no legitimate reason for withholding funds for Puerto Rico, which should have started flowing months ago, but perhaps that echoes foreign aid to the Ukraine. I'm not sure. While I'm glad we have testimony for the record from HUD and they briefed our members, I hope in the future they'll sit at the table alongside their federal partners and share with us future concerns about challenges and hopefully be able to report more successes. Glad the EDA is here. They can provide insight into administering the first tranche of supplemental disaster funding provided in the 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act, as well as any steps they're taking differently to approach the second tranche of funds. And as I've noted, FEMA's stretched thin. I fear it's delayed some of these larger recoveries beyond the delays being experienced as a slow CDBGDR process. These disaster-impacted communities in Oregon and elsewhere want nothing more than to recover quickly. Same goes for disaster survivors. And then, of course, the GAO can attest to delays in disaster recovery can be devastating for the economic well-being of the communities. Survivors can't work because they're tangled in red tape of recovery programs, and they risk losing their jobs, not being able to provide for their families. If businesses can't open because of workforce challenges or depleted customer bases, Coast Guard just awarded hundreds of millions of dollars to a firm constructing one of their new ships because of those factors. Delays with recovery can spiral out of control, and yet another catastrophe for these communities. So it's vital that each of the departments and agencies tasked with recovery have the resources and expertise to fulfill the missions, and for state and local governments to have the capacity and wherewithal to navigate these recovery programs as well. I look forward to hearing today what we can do to further decrease existing red tape, see where improvements can be made, assure that we're leveraging the interests of all parties, we're being more proactive in terms of resilience and getting ahead of these issues, and working between the government, nonprofit, and private sector to get our disaster-impacted communities on a quicker path to recovery. With that, Madam Chair, thanks for holding this important hearing.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Graves, who's the ranking member of TNO.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to thank Rhonda Wiley, who's going to be on our second panel today, for being here. She's from my district. She's the emergency manager, the 911 director, the floodplain manager for Atchison County, Missouri, which is my home county. Flooding in my district has made it, it's making it very difficult for us to move to full recovery mode. My district includes all of northwest Missouri. It actually runs all the way across to the Mississippi River and includes the Mississippi River too. So I've got the Missouri River on the west side and the Mississippi River on the east side. What's further complicating the efforts, our recovery efforts in northwest Missouri in particular, is we have a split declaration for individual assistance. So if you had flooding in your home in a certain period of time, it's covered, then there's a 2-week gap in there, and then if you had flooding in the second period of time, you're covered. And it's completely bizarre. If you qualify, and if your home was flooded during the selected dates, then you're all right. But if you're in that 2-week period, then you're in trouble, and it's a real problem. And it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, given the reforms that we passed in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that directed FEMA to give more consideration for localized impact and multiple recent disasters. But despite this, I have to say my constituents are very resourceful and very resilient. They've come together to pull resources, and they're helping each other. And as Ms. Wiley points out in her written testimony, we may have smaller populations in the rural areas like we have in my district, but our communities are critical to the nation's food supply and other resources. And when even a few people are displaced, it does cause significant impact to the local economy. And even where the homes and farms of families were not flooded, the roads and bridges to access those areas and those homes and communities are still underwater, and even as of today. It's hard to comprehend unless you're on the ground and there to actually see the extent of the flooding that's taken place. I'm pleased that along with FEMA that we have EDA here today so we can talk about rebuilding in a way that's also going to help with our local economic recovery. And last month, EDA announced $2.1 million in grants to communities in Missouri that have been hit by the disaster, including Clarksville, which is in my district, and also Mississippi County, which is in the southeast part of the state. In Clarksville, they're going to be using the money to design a movable flood wall that can protect the town from future flooding along the Mississippi River. And hope today that we can hear how FEMA and EDA are working together to help out, to quickly help out communities that are hit by the disaster, how we can ensure that rural and farming communities can recover faster and better. And with that, Madam Chair, I look forward to the testimony, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses for the first panel. We have Mr. Jeffrey Bayard, who is the Associate Administrator of the Office of Response and Recovery at FEMA, Mr. Dennis Alvord, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Economic Development Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and Mr. Chris Curry, Director of Homeland Security and Justice at the GAO. I want to thank you all for being with us today, and we look forward to your testimony. Since your testimony has been made a part of the record, I'd like to request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And now, without objection, I would ask that their full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so we'll go ahead and start. Thank you very much, Mr. Bayard.
Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Meadows, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, good morning. As the Associate Administrator of FEMA's Office of Response and Recovery, I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss our ongoing recovery efforts and how FEMA is preparing for future disasters. Over the past 2 years, FEMA has supported disaster operations in 47 states and all 6 territories, to include response and ongoing recovery efforts from historic hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. In 2019 alone, the President has already declared 56 major disasters and 13 emergency declarations. As noted, this is an unprecedented level of disaster activity, and it's been costly in both of terms of life and property. So, Chairman, it is not normal for what we've seen the past 2 years. During this time, FEMA's provided over $9 billion of financial assistance to disaster survivors. We have an estimated damage to infrastructure for the same time period is currently at $80 billion. However, FEMA cannot be the only solution. Our assistance is not designed to make individuals and communities whole after a disaster. Instead, our programs are designed to help recovery progress forward and catalyze investments and engagement from the whole community. Therefore, in the wake of the historic 2017 disasters, FEMA developed its strategic plan describing the optimal disaster response and recovery as this: state-managed, locally executed, and federally supported. In order to effectively carry out our mission, implement our strategic plan, and to address the range of challenges before us, the agency continues to find ways to improve and innovate. When disasters overwhelm state, local, tribal, and territorial partners, it is critical that FEMA has the right staff to support a timely response. Since 2017, FEMA has made significant changes to make sure the appropriate personnel are available to support the federal government's response, recovery, and provide positive results and outcomes to our disaster survivors. Today, I want to highlight 2 of those significant changes to FEMA's staffing model. First, the 2018 Incident Management Workforce Review works to permit FEMA to deploy the right people with the right skills to the right place at the right time to help our citizens. FEMA is realigning staff and consolidating duties where appropriate. We are currently working towards the implementation of the findings and look forward to the positive impact this will have on how we utilize our current disaster workforce. In addition, I also want to thank Congress for the passing of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act last year, which amended the Stafford Act to authorize FEMA to retain valuable knowledge, skills, and experience of our cadre of on-call response employees, our disaster workforce. In the spirit of innovation, FEMA has implemented both the public assistance delivery model nationwide. This simplifies the public assistance grant application process for our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. And Section 428 gives us the authority provided by Congress in the Sandy Improvement Act, which gives flexibility to applicants and expedites the overall project process. In addition, Congress has authorized a new pre-disaster mitigation program called BRIC, which with the goal of investing in proactive and research-supported community resilience rather than relying on reactive disaster spending, which will allow FEMA to effectively support our partners to recover from disasters. These authorities and initiatives are helping us deliver recovery assistance to your communities faster and more effectively than we have in the past. In the past few years of the disasters were historic, and the lessons learned continue to shape FEMA and the emergency management discipline as a whole. FEMA continues to work alongside our partners to provide key resources to the public during times of need. We recently released our 2019 Community Lifelines Implementation Toolkit for our community partners. This kit helps communities focus on the restoration of indispensable services, enabling continuous operation of critical business and government functions such as health, safety, and a better economic security and economic recovery. We will continue to work with our partners to collaborate and enhance our overall approach to stabilization of lifelines. The unifying effort in emergency management community will be the rapid stabilization of community lifelines. This effort reflected in the recent update of our National Response Framework. This update also includes the establishment of Emergency Support Function 14, which enforces the importance of private sector and how critical that section is to our economic recovery after disasters. I am pleased to be I am pleased to be here today and to represent the dedicated men and women of FEMA, to my opinion, the best in the federal government, and for the opportunity to discuss this important mission. I look forward to any questions and all questions you may have. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Alford. I think you need to.
Thank you. Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, Chairwoman Titus, Congresswoman Miller, on behalf of Ranking Member Meadows and members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure and a privilege to appear before you today to testify on behalf of the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration. I bring greetings on behalf of Assistant Secretary Fleming, who sends his regards. EDA welcomes this hearing as an opportunity to discuss our role in post-disaster long-term recovery efforts in communities hard hit by disasters. Restoring economic prosperity to all parts of this great nation is an important priority of the administration. A strong economy is critical to helping communities hit by natural disasters to get back on their feet. EDA is presently operating under the Continuing Appropriations Act of 2020 while concurrently implementing $1.2 billion in disaster supplemental funding provided by the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 and the Disaster Relief Act of 2019. Shortly after Congress appropriated the first $600 million in supplemental funds to EDA for disasters occurring in calendar year 2017, EDA took a number of proactive steps to effectively manage the significant increase in funding. One important step was the establishment of 4 disaster supplemental implementation teams to maintain focused, well-coordinated oversight and administration of the supplemental funding. The teams include communications, data and tools, coordination and operations, and hiring and training. These teams have played a critical role in enabling the agency to manage the substantial increase in workload while mitigating agency risk. And we are currently updating this model with lessons learned over the last year and a half, making us even more effective with the new disaster supplemental Congress provided in June of 2019 for calendar year 2018 disasters and 2019 floods and tornadoes. EDA's role in disaster recovery is to facilitate the timely and effective delivery of federal economic development assistance to support long-term community economic recovery through planning and project implementation, redevelopment, and resiliency. EDA coordinates regional disaster recovery efforts in partnership with an extensive network of 392 economic development districts, 52 tribal partnership planning organizations, 64 university centers, and other partners in impacted areas. In FY 2018, EDA made $587 million available to eligible grantees in communities where the President declared a major disaster under the Stafford Act as a result of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, wildfires, and other natural disasters in 2017. Under a Notice of Funding Opportunity published in April of 2018, EDA awarded disaster grants through the agency's Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. This program is the EDA's most flexible tool and allows the agency to make awards that support a wide range of construction and non-construction activities in areas that experience sudden and severe economic dislocation, as happens with a major disaster. As of September 30, 2019, EDA has obligated $463 million, or 79% of its $587 million in programmatic FY18 disaster supplemental funding, in some 174 awards to communities across the country. EDA is also actively evaluating an additional 38 proposals and applications, which, if funded, would account for 100% of EDA's FY18 disaster supplemental appropriation. EDA, on behalf of the Department of Commerce, also plays a critical role as the designated coordinating agency of the Economic Recovery Support Function under the federal government's National Disaster Recovery Framework. In this capacity, EDA provides leadership and coordination for primary and support agencies, which share a role in the provision of grants, loans, training, and other forms of assistance to support economic recovery efforts in disaster-impacted communities and regions. An important new tool in EDA's disaster recovery toolbox is Opportunity Zones. As you know, Opportunity Zones were created under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to stimulate economic development and job creation by incentivizing long-term investments in disadvantaged areas across the country. As the agency whose principal role is to make investments in economically distressed communities to create jobs, foster resiliency, and accelerate long-term growth, the Opportunity Zone initiative fits hand in glove with EDA's mission. As such, EDA has been working to promote Opportunity Zone investments across the country and is making grants in Opportunity Zones in communities impacted by natural disasters. In furtherance of this new tool, EDA has made public works and economic adjustment projects in Opportunity Zones eligible for EDA assistance as a special need criteria under its regular programs, and added Opportunity Zones as one of our 5 investment priorities. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address EDA's efforts to enhance global competitiveness of America's regions. I'm proud of the agency's long history and its critical role in supporting communities needing to make long-term investments following natural disasters. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Curry?
Thank you, Chairman Titus, DeFazio, Ranking Members Miller and Graves. It's an honor to be here today to talk about GAO's work on disaster recovery. Over the years at GAO, we've looked at almost every aspect of disaster recovery across the government. And what we've seen in the recent years is only an increasing amount of support being provided to state and local governments, and the expectation for disaster assistance from the feds increasing. Since 2005, the federal government has provided almost $500 billion in disaster assistance, and a lot of that funding goes towards long-term recovery, particularly public infrastructure projects at the state and local level. To be clear, recovery would not be possible without these federal resources. And in our work across the country, we see the dedicated people at FEMA and other federal agencies trying to help state and local communities recover. However, as many of the members on the committee know, that what we also hear is that recovery can often be the slow disaster that happens after the disaster. If you've had a federal disaster in your jurisdiction, which I think most everybody here has, you know that these programs can be slow, complicated, and frankly very frustrating to deal with. I'd like to talk today just about some of our recent work and some of the examples and hopefully some of the solutions that we see moving forward. In Puerto Rico specifically, I think this has been a case study in some of the complexity and challenges in recovery. So far, FEMA told us just last week there are 14 approved large public infrastructure projects in Puerto Rico 2 years after Maria. The problem with that is there's 9,000 island-wide, and so it's not going to get any easier over the next few months to a year to try to pin down cost estimates and get these projects rolling. What we've seen in some of these places is the rollout of new programs that have lacked policies and procedures and created some confusion on both sides. To be fair, though, it's not easy to just instantly, after a disaster, manage $20 to $30 billion in recovery grants. Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and places like that have had to build the capacity to manage these types of funds since they're disasters, and that's also led to some of the delays that we have seen. HUD's Community Development Block Grant Program has also been mentioned. There's also been incredible frustration at the state and local level with the speed of that program. We found just this year it took almost a year or more just to get to a place of having a grant agreement between HUD and the state or the territory. And this is just an agreement about how the program's going to work. This isn't even about obligating funding or spending money. Of the almost $40 billion that was mentioned today since 2017 that HUD has received from Congress, about $7 billion has been obligated, and $112 million out of $40 billion has been actually spent on projects. So I think this is not a pace that anybody at the federal level or at the state and local level would think is ideal. Another thing I want to point out that we hear consistently at the state and local level is how challenging it is to coordinate and synchronize all of these federal programs. I want to make it clear that these federal programs were never designed for recovery to all work together at the same time. You have HUD, DOT, FEMA, EDA, all sorts of different federal agencies. All these programs have different rules, they have different timeframes, and they have different paperwork requirements. So if you're a state and local emergency manager, trying to coordinate all of these things at the same time for one recovery plan is extremely challenging. I'd like to end by also talking about the importance of resilience. This is something that's been mentioned here at the hearing. I think that the committee and Congress and FEMA and other agencies have really moved the ball forward in terms of providing the additional funding and the flexibilities that we need to allow these programs to get creative and rebuild in a resilient way. The one caution that I would have that we're seeing in our work is that it's great that the legislation is there, but these things have to sink into the actual programs and have to be executed the way you want them to be executed. And what we've seen so far is some confusion so far about how these flexibilities are going to be able to change existing programs that have frankly been run the same way for many, many years. And so it's going to require change management efforts at the agencies. It's going to require new training for employees and overcoming some challenges to make sure they're doing what you want them to do. This completes my prepared remarks. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was helpful. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as a memo dated September 17th, 2019, from the HUD Inspector General to the HUD Secretary. All right, with that objection, we'll enter that into the record. Now we're going to move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. I know that some of the members have specific disasters in their areas that they're going to want to ask about where things are and what the problems are. So I'm going to limit some of my questions to the kind of general overall themes that y'all have brought up. Mr. Curry, what you said about needing to change is always a criticism of bureaucracy. You know, it just gets kind of hidebound and it's difficult to change that. Do you have any specific recommendations about perhaps consolidating some of these programs, bringing the HUD grant program under FEMA? You've outlined the problem, but do you have any solutions for us?
Yes, ma'am. I think certainly it's not GAO's place to sort of to make those kind of policy decisions. That's up to Congress to decide and the different oversight committees if you want to consolidate the programs. It's definitely an option. But until that happens, I think there are other options to help address this issue. For example, we know that in these large disasters, we know the programs that are used in recovery, and we know how they've operated in the past. And you can make changes to those programs so they're better synchronized to work together instead of just being surprised after the disaster. So in the case of HUD, for example, we recommended recently that Congress permanently authorize the program. That's been a challenge. Each time Congress appropriates money to HUD, HUD basically has to recreate the program in a Federal Register notice, which you all probably know federal rulemaking is not the easiest process. So every time that happens, that has to occur. So whether that is authorized in HUD or another program, I think we need to have a permanently authorized program so we don't have to create this from scratch each time.
Thank you. Mr. Byard, another problem that seems to come up over and over again are the workforce shortfalls. People are hired temporarily, they go work on a disaster, then they go home or go back to wherever they're from. We're 1,000 people short, you have to gear up every time something happens. Do you have any recommendations for how we might address that shortage?
Yes, ma'am, that's it's a definite challenge, as you've pointed out. I do think it's important to note, though, that staffing challenges are primarily or really fully on the recovery end of that. We have the staff necessary in the way we do our business from a response standpoint. All the available staff is ready to respond, and it's also important to note that FEMA is a coordinating element, so we have just tremendous partnerships throughout the federal government to effectively respond to any disaster that the nation faces. So we do have shortfalls, but I want to make sure that we understand from a response standpoint to that immediate life-saving ability, FEMA is prepared to do that and will continue to prepare to do that. The type of individuals and staff that you highlighted are disaster reservists. And I must say, ma'am, they are the backbone of what we do. They do tremendous work in all of your communities. So one of the areas that we're looking at to increase that is looking at a regional reservist cadre. So you have certain individuals that definitely want to do great work for the American people that we do, but they may not want to travel all the way across the country. So, for example, in our hurricane-prone regions, we're looking at how do we bring on retired engineers, for example, that understand bridges and roads, that want to work just in that area. That's one area that we're doing. We're also, as working through Congress, increasing our recovery staffing. We're bringing on about 1,000 a year right now. But we also got to look at our retention. Bringing new staff on is just one thing, and we've made a concerted effort. The acting administrator, as well as myself, have challenged our leadership to find out why our staff may be leaving and how do we increase and keep that staff here. So,
What about the possibility of legislation that would guarantee if somebody left a job, say working in the Montana Wildlife Division, to go fight a fire in California, that they are guaranteed they'll have that job when they come back?
Ma'am, that's not for me to
No,
make
but
that.
you could say if that might work or not.
There's a lot of complexities in it. I guess what you're laying out is similar to what our Department of Defense does with the National Guard and so forth.
Right.
I would have to know a little more about that before I commented on one way or the other. But I do think that as we look at certain jobs programs and especially one of the innovative measures we may want to look at is with our two-year universities, our trade schools, of really teaching public assistance program. These are well-paying jobs that are out there, and we've got plenty of work to go around. So I think there may be some other avenues to look at because we want to not only retain or build our reservist cadre, but we need to retain that knowledge for future disasters.
I think maybe we need to look at veterans too more closely and how we put some veterans in these positions. But
I agree. As a veteran, I agree, ma'am.
Just briefly, we're spending nearly $300 million to renovate and consolidate DHS headquarters, yet we don't have a secretary, a deputy secretary, a general counsel, or an undersecretary. I just worry that without leadership at the top, some of these recommendations that you're making or that we're considering may just fall through the cracks.
Ma'am.
That's all right. I'm out of time, but
Yes, ma'am.
think about that. I'll now recognize Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus, for holding this hearing today, and thank you all for being here. I recently came back from my district work period where I held a roundtable in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. The purpose of the roundtable was to discuss the dissemination of flood recovery funding. In 2016, 3 schools in Nicholas County, West Virginia, were destroyed due to flood damage. During the storms, hundreds of people were displaced from their homes and 26 people died. The reality is that we have people who have been in temporary housing since 2016, and we have schools that need to be rebuilt. It is inexcusable that it has taken 3 years to put people back into their homes and rebuilding our schools. I understand that the community recovery is a long process. However, we all have people in our districts that need help. We owe it to our constituents to be efficient and to make sure that they are receiving the funding that they need. Mr. Byard, How can the federal government incentivize states to encourage the state to spend money in a timely manner and to ensure that the money is given to the people who have suffered from the disaster?
Ma'am, I want to make sure I can answer your question correctly. So from the FEMA aspect and perspective, the authorities that we have to help individuals is our Individual Assistance Program, which we do direct financial assistance and other assistance directly to the disaster survivors. As far as what the state may do over and above that, I'm not familiar with that state to state. Also, I know and I believe that there was a CDBG-DR allocation for West Virginia that was for the purposes of housing. And again, I would have to, yield to HUD for the specifics and the state for the specifics on that. I do and am familiar with the schools that you referenced, and I know our regional administrator, Mary Ann Tierney, has been there multiple times. She's a fantastic representative of FEMA, and we're working through that now. Some of that had to do with some environmental studies and surveys, so I know we're making progress on the schools, but I don't want to overspeak on the exact housing question that you had, because I know we do direct grants to individuals based on the eligibility requirements of each citizen.
Thank you, and I will say that Ms. Tierney has been very helpful and has met with us several times.
Yes, ma'am.
How are you working to ensure that entities recuperate and rebuild after severe natural disasters that destroy things like the broadband and water and sewer, the utilities that, in my mind, are really essential?
Yes, ma'am. I would, you heard me on my opening talk about stabilization of community lifelines. There's 7 community lifelines that, regardless if you're, the District of Columbia or small town Alabama, small town West Virginia, that have to happen. The infrastructure is one of those. I would submit that utilizing the authorities of Congress and looking at our BRIC initiatives, the mitigation before a storm hits, we should harden this infrastructure before a disaster hits. There's ways to do that. You've given us, we've got $250 million additional dollars this year within that program. That will hopefully grow. So I think that we first need to look at what are we doing before storm hits to harden this infrastructure. Quite frankly, if the power and the water can stay on, that's 90% of FEMA or a state emergency manager or a local emergency manager's problems are solved then.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Alvord, can you discuss how the Opportunity Zone Initiative will generate long-term impact?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, we, as you may know, have long held private investment as one of our key criterion for successful economic development. And the 2 primary focuses of EDA's traditional grant-making programs are in generating private investment and in creating jobs in economically distressed areas and regions. In the case of opportunity zones, with the additional tax incentives that are available and the qualified opportunity funds that are being formed, we see an opportunity to exponentially leverage that private investment. So we anticipate that EDA will be able to make strategic grant investments in opportunity zone areas that will create the conditions that are conducive to that investment by qualified opportunity funds. And rather than receiving a small amount of additional private investment, we could see 5, 10, 25 times or more in additional private investment flowing into those areas.
Have you run into any challenges when trying to expand opportunity zones in rural parts of the country, like West Virginia?
So the Opportunity Zone Initiative is a relatively new initiative, and there's actually still a process underway to clarify all the regulations and requirements that accompany the incentive. As a result, we're seeing a lot of the early activity is flowing into areas where there are investments that are ripe and ready to move, many of those in urban areas. However, we do anticipate that as the initiative continues to mature, more and more funding will flow into other outlying areas as well.
Okay, thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Garamendi.
I thought the gentle lady from West Virginia might say, like California. Yes, all things are local. Just a couple of questions. This will be for Mr. Beauregard. Thank you.
Buyer, yes, sir.
Thank you. I want to discuss how federal disaster recovery funds flow from FEMA to local recipients. Under current practices, local communities are often required to use their own limited funds following a disaster to front the money for disaster recovery efforts and projects before they can then seek federal reimbursement for those costs. The fact is, let me just cite Butte County, the Camp Fire. Small rural communities simply lack the cash necessary to front the local funds while they wait months, years, in many cases, for reimbursement for FEMA. So first, I assume you're aware of this situation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I am.
Good. Then what are you doing about it?
So, first, let me say that's one of the most devastating disasters in 17 years that I've been to. I went and visited with the leadership out there. I'm familiar with this, primarily putting my state hat on of, again, 17 years, 14 years of that I was with state emergency management, so I understand the question very, very well. It's important first to know that, under the Stafford Act, FEMA is a reimbursement agency. We reimburse local and state governments.
I'm aware of that, but my question is, so what do you propose be done about it? If the law doesn't allow it, you suggesting a change in law, a change in regulations. What would you suggest we do about it?
I don't know what that change would be, sir, how we would front load dollars into a local community
Well, let
to
me
pay
give
for
you an
their
example.
response.
You're building a house. You hire a contractor. You've got a bank that's financing the construction loan, right? Yes, that's how it's done. The construction loan, when the contractor signs the contract, there's 10%. Okay? When the foundation is poured, there's another 10, 15%. When the framing is done, another amount of money. Is it possible that we develop something that would allow the local community on signing a contract get upfront money? They sign a contract with the contractor that's going to repair the bridge. Does that make sense?
Sir, I would definitely look at that. I think that there's one element of the puzzle that's missing here that's very vital in anything emergency management, and that's the state. So I would say, what could a state do to help a local community in that situation? I know in certain states they do that, in certain states they don't, and that's dependent on the state.
You don't believe there's a role for the federal government to do it, but it's a state responsibility?
Sir, I believe that we all have a responsibility in emergency management. The federal supported, state managed, and locally executed works. I would be happy to sit down with you and your staff to see where we could do that. Look, the two things that hit a local community hardest in any disaster is overtime. They don't budget for that. They can delay contractors, but they don't budget for overtime, so I'm definitely...
Well, you're down into the weeds. The fact of the matter is it could be possible for FEMA to front-load it if they had the authority, and the authority comes from us. So we should consider that for certainly the smaller communities that do not have funds to address that. Also, there's been a major effort to try to do pre-disaster mitigation. 6% of the total funds are available. And this is really a question for Mr. Curry. How's it going?
So that program, so Congress, you authorized that in the DRRA. And so basically FEMA has gone to work trying to implement that program, but it has to be done through a federal rulemaking and a federal regulation, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is not an easy and short process. So they are in the middle of that, which, as you know, has multiple phases. And so the program hasn't been implemented yet because it hasn't fully gone through the rulemaking process.
Have you had a chance to analyze the proposal?
I haven't seen or analyzed the proposal. We haven't reported on it. I mean, in general, we think that the set-aside of the additional funding for pre-disaster mitigation is a fantastic idea because it allows us to more strategically spend money around the country instead of letting Mother Nature dictate where we spend it.
There's an ancillary to that, and that is in the recovery effort, this is a public recovery effort, can the agency build for resiliency, or must they only build for what was there prior to the...
Well, that's been the biggest problem with recovery over the years, is that the way the programs used to be structured is you could only build back exactly the way it was before. That has been changed now through recent legislation. So, but however, as I said up front, you know, it's going to take a little while for that to get down into the programs and to the employees to make sure that's actually happening. So as someone else mentioned, we're not fighting over doorknobs.
We should turn our attention to that as a committee. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Byard. Are you familiar with the gap in Missouri that we have that I mentioned in my opening statement?
Yes, sir, I am.
Are we working to rectify that? And can you give me a little bit of background on that? And just for, I might explain it again too for the committee's awareness. So we have a gap between April 16th and April 29th. And our first flooding incident occurred in March. But we have two different disaster declarations. And our second event occurred later on. We had houses that were flooded in that gap. We also, and I also want you to address, we have people that have applied for assistance, have received it, and then somebody's come back around then and said, no, you're going to have to give that back, which is creating a lot of problem as well. In fact, a lot of problem. That gets my office involved, which is a complete waste of resources when we should have to deal with that. But can you give me a little bit of background on what's going on with that? Can we get that fixed? Can we move past it? Something.
Yes, sir. So when the governor requests for a declaration, it's there for a specific weather event. When there's a situation like Missouri, we look at, or the state generally looks at, what the National Weather Service has provided from meteorological data of was it the same event, was it a separate event. You know, sometimes in this position, there's things that are in the law, but in your case, you know, citizens flooded, they're flooded. So I'm not gonna, but that's how we look at it. We look at it as a separate system. Therefore, it has to meet and standalone criteria for assistance. As far as the recoupment, that's the first I've heard of that. Chairman, I've made a note of that. I'm going to figure out what's going on with that as soon as I get out of here.
So we have, you know, and when it comes to a particular weather event, when it rains, you know, and the water comes up, in fact, when it rains north of Gavin's Point, or it rains, you know, as we had the big weather event out across the Platte River Valley in Nebraska, it takes a long time for that water to get to us. And then when you couple that with the Corps of Engineers releasing more and more water through the reservoirs coming down, the rain may have passed and it may be clear blue skies out there, but the water's coming up and it's coming up fast and it breaks the levees and it floods people out. So it's very frustrating to me when we're, you know, dictating or putting out these dates based on, you know, this weather event and that weather event, when we have people that flooded, you know, and I know specific examples that flooded in that time frame, you know, and you take the town of Craig, Missouri, just one of the communities that flooded in my district, and the water's coming up and it continues to come up. It kept coming up right on through that date range and flooded a lot of people out, yet they're not eligible for assistance. And so we put these arbitrary dates out there on an event like this, and it's creating a lot of problems, You know, and what's frustrating to a lot of those people too is, you know, folks north of them, that's the state of Missouri, you know, in Iowa and Nebraska that are getting the same water, the same rain events and everything, and they're not dealing with that. And Missouri was slow to do their disaster declaration, which didn't help any at all, but it still shouldn't be a problem for folks. And we do have people, though, getting back to the other point, people being asked to return dollars because for whatever reason, FEMA's come in and said, no, your house flooded in this date range. You know, we made a mistake on giving you funds, and that's, I mean, this is bad. It really is, and it's affecting the lives of a lot of people out there. And you know, we need to be a little bit more aware of that. You know, and even the attitude with some of the folks that are coming out and doing the assessments. And I might ask you about that too. Have your folks on the ground, the folks that are out there doing the assessments, are they having problems with that? I know we still have water standing since March in some of those areas, and they can't even get in there to do the assessments. But it's starting to go down. Are they having any better luck getting assessments done?
Sir, I will check with our federal coordinating officer there in Missouri and see where we are on that. When we look at flooding in that magnitude, the incident period, however, even though, you mentioned two separate incidents or two separate weather events, but for a declared flood of that magnitude, we do leave that incident period open, sometimes 3, 4, 5 months, so that water can go down and we know where it is. But the two get-backs I have for you is the recoupment. I want to find out about why we're recouping dollars from citizens, and then what is our ability to assess still flooded areas of your part of the state? Is that?
Well, I want to specifically address too this gap, and I'd encourage you too to talk to the folks from Atchison County and get a better understanding, because they are absolutely on the ground and dealing with it every single day. But I definitely want you to do that. They're here today. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Mucarsel Powell?
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this such an important hearing. As it's been mentioned several times, most of us here are really representing areas that are affected by stronger and stronger storms and disasters. And the first thing I want to say, Mr. Byard, which you probably don't hear that much, is thank you. Because in May, we had another hearing, and it was Mr. Kanueski who testified before our subcommittee, and I was stressing the importance of getting these FEMA reimbursements after Hurricane Irma. It's been over 2 years, and very promptly we started seeing those reimbursements flow. Unfortunately, we are still owed over $100 million in Miami-Dade County alone. And I'm just very concerned because it's been 2 years. We were very fortunate to dodge Hurricane Dorian, and we've incurred costs because of that. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we're still waiting and holding, FEMA's still holding over $100 million just for Miami-Dade County alone. So my first quick question, if you could please assure me that you'll go back to your team and try to expedite those remaining reimbursements, I would greatly appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. In May, I also brought up the fact that Keys Energy, which is the public power utility in the lower Florida Keys, was owed over $43 million from FEMA. And in May, FEMA had obligated about $15 million, but we've only gotten $2 million paid to Keys Energy. And it's now October, and they're still waiting, so FEMA's sitting on $28 million, and this is highly costly because they've had to take out loans to make up for this difference. Without this money, we are in even greater danger if we're still in hurricane season, believe it or not, in Florida. So I know that in your testimony, you talked about the ways that FEMA has been simplifying and streamlining its grant application process. But I have to be honest with you, it's not working for everyone. I know that you are trying to have a better response, a timely response, but we're not seeing that in Florida. The FEMA team responsible for working directly with Keys Energy has changed a number of times. Just imagine, over the past 2 years, since October 2017, we've had 7 different project development grant managers, which, Mr. Curry, you were talking about how costly and how complicated the process of overseeing disaster recovery efforts is. Well, it doesn't help when you have changes like this. 7 different staff members in FEMA overseeing this project. Every time there's a new person, we have to start all over again. So FEMA has Keys Energy walk them through the audits, walk them through the project worksheets, everything. Thankfully, they've had a consistent team since May, so I'm hoping that there's consistency there and that we can see improvement in the streamlining process. But I think that my suggestion is that we need to figure out a way to have staff be even present during storms, someone that has the authority to make those decisions for approval, which I think would cut the timeliness of getting those reimbursements and the approval process of all the audits that FEMA requests. So, Mr. Byard, can you also please assure me that you can help with the Keys Energy reimbursements 2 years later?
Yes, ma'am, I will.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I just heard yesterday that even though there has been $15 million that has been obligated, FEMA has directed the Florida Division of Emergency Management to hold the money until the payments are reviewed further. Can you explain why this is happening?
Ma'am, I will have to get with our Region 4 partners. We obligate to the state The state then, does that reimbursement to an applicant like Q Power. We are doing validate as you go. That may have something to do with it, but that doesn't sound like it. Where we're and what that process is as I alluded to, it's a reimbursement program. So Q Power would show where they had eligible work. They would show those costs were eligible. The reimbursement would go. The beauty of that is when the project's done, there's no more waiting for closeout. It's closed there. But to your point, I would need to get with our Region 4, and I will do that.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
definitely Miami-Dade County and Keys Power, several issues with Keys Power.
Thank you. So one quick question, and you can all answer and give me your ideas here, but what is it that we need to do to better streamline this process? You talked about the states, but it is the responsibility of these federal agencies to respond in a timely manner. I've been to Puerto Rico, and I've seen the delay in response there as well. So what is it that we need to do? And I would love to hear from each one of you briefly, if that's possible. Thank you.
From my perspective, what we've seen on the response side, meaning leading up right to the disaster and the days after the disaster, we've seen huge improvements since Hurricane Katrina in terms of FEMA being there on the ground. I think it's really the recovery programs that are still causing a lot of challenges. And it's what I said in my opening statement. I think there are so many different federal programs that come together with different rules, requirements, and regulations, and it's extremely difficult for state and local emergency managers to figure out how to synchronize and manage all those programs.
Thank you. I think our time is out. Y'all might talk later about that if you want to add something to it. Now, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I've got some questions for you, Mr. Baird, about FEMA and the debris removal. Alabama was hit by a swarm of tornadoes in April of 2011. Massive damage statewide, the worst outbreak in the history of the state. And in the aftermath and the debris removal, I think FEMA typically contracts out the debris removal to the Corps of Engineers. Is that correct?
Well, sir, not necessarily, but I'll be happy to kind of high level talk you through how that goes.
Well, I have a pretty good idea of how it goes, and that's what I want to talk about, is that in Alabama, the debris removal cost was being handled through the Corps of Engineers. They were contracting it out to look like a single bid contractor, and it was about $40 per cubic yard. Fortunately, there were some county engineers and others in the state that were not willing to do that, and what would have happened there is that even at that price, when the final tally came in, then the state would have had to reimburse FEMA for anywhere from 10 to 25% of the removal cost. In a couple of cases, and I've got an article here, Madam Chairman, that I'd like to enter into the record from, if I may, that details this. Thank you, ma'am. They went out and got their own bids, and in one case, it was $10 per cubic yard. County did that. And this was a small county, had about 600,000 cubic yards of debris. At $10 a cubic yard, that's a savings of about $15 million. And I'm not really going after FEMA. I mean, ultimately, we want to get the debris removed and people back to normal as quick as possible. But when you're talking about a small county and $15 million, it's not only a massive savings for the federal government, because the federal government would have paid a big part of that, but it's a major savings for counties, and these small counties would have really struggled. One of them was a city in Cullman County. They wouldn't have had the money to pay their share. So my question to you, sir, is when this occurs, where the county or the local government contracts it out themselves and handles that themselves, then FEMA, they have to submit an invoice to FEMA for FEMA to pay them back. When it takes FEMA months to reimburse these cities, it's really a hardship on them. Is there any way we could expedite this? Because it's beneficial to the federal government as well as it is to these localities.
Yes, sir. And I was actually the state coordinating officer for Alabama in 2011. We lost 250 Alabamians in one day, over 50 counties declared.
I was
So,
there. I had damage at my place.
Exactly.
Trees down in the yard.
At that point, the state, blame me,
I'm not blaming
based on
anybody.
Governor Bentley, requested the Corps due to debris removal in many counties. Some of that is those counties did not have to do any upfront costs. They did not have to do the reimbursement. What Alabama did since then, I think is very proactive, is we divided the state up in districts and have pre-event already vetted through FEMA contracts. I was a part of that as we worked with FEMA Region 4. So counties and cities within that county were able to, if declared, working through the County Commission Association, we had contracts in place that went through the proper bid procedures and so forth. So that's one area that will definitely increase the reimbursement piece of that. One of the biggest issues we see in debris removal is the procurement of that contract post-storm. So anything that can be done before an event that we can sit down with the FEMA legal team, the state legal team, and make sure it fits that procurement procedure is a good practice.
Well, I think it's in the best interest of all of us that if FEMA could streamline the reimbursement to these localities that can't afford to do that, because the savings are enormous. I'd also like to ask about, just a quick question, do you have any idea how much of the disaster relief money for Sandy, for the Sandy recovery is still unspent?
No, sir, I can get you a balance of that. I do not have that in front of me.
If you would, I would appreciate that very much.
Yes, sir.
Madam Chairman, I had other questions, but my time is fastly evaporating. I yield back.
Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus. This hearing today is incredibly important to myself, to the people I represent, and to all of my colleagues here. And like them, I also represent an area that's been devastated by several disasters, and appreciate the work that FEMA has done to help our community recover. I represent Texas's 7th Congressional District in Houston, and so we are still recovering not only from Hurricane Harvey, but from the Tax Day flood, the Memorial Day flood. We now have damage from Imelda, so we're continuing to see these challenges. And one consistent theme that I hear from my constituents is that we want to figure out how to do this faster. We continue to have similar storms. No storm is the same. But how can we streamline and improve the process? And so that's something I want to put to everyone on the panel. But I also want to start with an observation. We have just now, 2 years later, gotten several projects approved from FEMA, and so I appreciate that. I know that the North Canal project, as well as the Inwood Golf Course project and the Lake Houston Dam project, are all going to move forward. That said, it's been 2 years, more than 2 years since Harvey and since these projects were proposed. And there is a common frustration throughout our community because these projects cannot go forward until they've been approved by FEMA, or will jeopardize the matching funds. We have some legislation that's passed this committee to try to streamline some of that process, but it's for a limited number of projects. And so I guess what I would love to hear from you all is what can be done to improve the timeline for federal consideration of these hazard mitigation projects. Because for many people who spend the money to repair their homes, but the hazard mitigation project can't commence, so they're concerned, and I can tell you every time it rains, people in my district are concerned that their house is going to flood again because we haven't been able to build the additional detention or do other projects that could help change the outcome. So can you talk a little bit about that? What can we do to improve this timeline? Mr. Byard, maybe I'll start with you.
Yes, ma'am. So as it relates to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which I believe is what you're referring to as a post-disaster grant program, a lot of the time constraints that program hits deals with the environmental process, the environmental assessments that need to be done. I can definitely check on where we are on those specific projects as it relates to Houston. However, with the BRIC program, that is one of the goals, is to get more funding upfront so that we can do these projects, when it's not already destroyed, so to speak.
Sure.
It's better to do it up front, save money, and then have a less recovery. But I can definitely check on the specifics of where we are on those projects for Houston. But if I had to not have it in front of me, it's probably somewhere in the environmental review process.
Well, that's helpful. I appreciate that. And I think it's not just for my own district, but for all of us.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
think what are the things that we can do legislatively? What are the ways that we can be helpful in streamlining some of the challenges that cause the review process to take so long? If there are legislative opportunities, I think it would be helpful for all of us to know them so we can try to move them through this committee.
Yes, ma'am.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'd offer a quick observation, I think, and I'll draw a quick distinction between response and recovery, because I think you're dealing with two different scenarios. And EDA is most involved in the economic recovery portion of disasters. And I think we've seen some great opportunities in the context of the National Disaster Recovery Framework and the Economic Recovery Support Function in those instances where we have been activated to deploy to a joint field office. And federal agencies are working hand in glove together to try to differentiate one another's assistance and provide clear guidance to our stakeholders about which agency can best meet their needs on the ground. And this not only helps us to move in a more timely fashion to get the assistance to those that need it, but it also ultimately results in a more efficient and effective disaster recovery response because we're guarding against duplication and overlap. If we know that one need is most cleanly met by a certain agency, that agency can then tackle that problem and we can move on to the next challenge.
I appreciate that. I would like to sort of put out for you all to consider and maybe help us come up with a solution here, because I agree that what my constituents see and find very frustrating is that different agencies can help with different things. And so if we look at this from a sort of victim-centric focus, instead of having to call FEMA, oh, you should call SBA, well, that's gonna come through the city or that's gonna come through the state or the county. There are so many different programs, and I think for someone in the immediate aftermath of a disaster or in long-term recovery, that process can be very confusing. And so I think suggestions that you all would have for us that we could implement that would make it easier for the victims of these disasters to navigate that process would be extremely helpful. I see that I've gone over my time, so I appreciate your being here this morning, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. LaMalfa?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate sitting in on the committee today. The issue in Northern California has been pretty tough last couple of years, starting with the Oroville Dam, the state water project spillway, and FEMA and the administration responded very quickly on that. And as well, then we had in 2018 the Carr Fire in West Redding, 230,000 acres burned, 1,600 buildings lost, eight deaths after the Carr Fire. And then finally, it capped last November. We're coming up on the anniversary of the Camp Fire in Paradise, California. 150,000 acres burned, 18,000 buildings destroyed, and 86 lives lost, all told in that. Humongous tragedy. Of course, a big part of my job and my office and my team at home has been working really hard on this, is helping the town of Paradise and surrounding areas, Magalia, Concow, Yankee Hill, others to recover on that, as well as finishing up on the Carr Fire, where people are recovering there. Town of Paradise, for example, people have been very patient, very resilient on this issue. Even the Paradise High football team has outscored their opponents 362-40 and is undefeated right now. So, you know, everybody's really hanging in there strong with resilience. And FEMA, I commend you, Administrator Byard, on, again, the immediacy of getting resources and the support on the Camp Fire for removing the toxic material on each footprint where a home or a building is burned down, and seeing the need on that watershed to just get that out and get it moved to approved waste areas. And so tens of thousands of truck trips later, it's pretty much complete up there, and a lot of building permits, home permits are being let, and recovery's happening. So great work on that, working with Cal OES, Office of Emergency Services, and local governments on that. So there's always people that are going to, there's always an impatience with resources don't get there as fast as people want, and untangling issues and red tape. And so let's talk just real quick about the concept of temporary housing for folks who have been displaced. And again, we're thankful for all this. But there was some issues in setting up temporary housing sites for people to dwell. They were scattered all over. Many in the town of Chico, maybe half of the 27,000 displaced, which has caused Chico issues and crowding and traffic. But temporary housing versus looking at how do we narrow that timeline? 6 months to identified site, 10 months to start moving people in, and I know it's a circumstance, but how can we narrow that? And is there efficiency maybe with funding permanent homes instead of the temporary homes? Is there a way we can hopscotch that and find opportunities to put our focus towards permanent buildings? Can you touch on that, please?
Yes, sir. So, housing is a difficult mission, even in the best of times. For the example of Paradise, or normally we in a lot of cases, we're able to put a temporary housing unit or manufactured housing unit on an individual's lot. As you well know, due to the toxic environment that the debris caused, we cannot do that in Paradise. So we actually had to find group sites, which it then relies on local governments as far as where can we put those. The federal government at FEMA, we do a good job of reimbursement, but the land has to be granted or given or permitted for us to do that. Then we have to come in and basically build a neighborhood from sewer, power, and so forth in certain areas. We try to find where we can, like a campsite that's already built like that, something like that. And a lot of times that works. Matter of fact, we did
my
that.
time's going to be short on this, I'm sorry. So just kind of getting to the crux here. How can we narrow that timeline? I know it's been tough to identify some of these areas, and we had to do a lot of things with campgrounds and parks and others, but what can we focus on to narrow that timeline?
I would look at, again, how do our state and local partners, can they identify lands that could be used for a group site in the event they need that we can come in a lot more efficient fashion and do that.
Okay. Hey, now, we've got another issue, too. I'm sorry, again, the time. Orphan roads, they call them. They're basically kind of like public roads, kind of like private, mostly seen as private, but they're used by everybody, emergency services, utilities, others, and there's folks really concerned up there that removal of debris along these roads. We still have 1 million trees up there. They got to be removed. And I know FEMA is looking at trees being part of the problem up there of not only along roadways but a little farther inland, and so we need more attention on that. And I know you're working in that direction, but we have to remember that these dead trees out there are going to continue to be a problem. That kind of gets back to forestry management in general, where somebody was talking about pre-disaster planning. The forestry in the West is a disaster, pre-disaster, a lot of it. So I'd appreciate, keep paying attention on how we can remove these trees that are already burned and dead and in place, and should be seen as part of the cleanup. So, and then I'll just leave a quick note. You did a great job on clearing land in the Whiskeytown area on the Carr Fire on a private clearing, but also there was park land nearby where you didn't have the jurisdiction to clean up a toxic building that had burned down on park land, so national park land. So we got to be able to look at what would be sensible when you're there to do work, that can you also do it on the national park land? And is there a regulation, let me ask you on that, is there a
Mr.
regulation we
Ramafa.
could change? Please get back to my office. Thank you, madam. I'm sorry, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on something just for the record that Mr. Garamendi brought up about helping local communities that have difficulty paying for their recovery work up front. According to the Cash Management Improvement Act, FEMA can currently pay local governments on the basis of invoices before locals have to pay their vendors. Can you address why you aren't using that or what the problem might be?
That's, there are certain situations when we can do that. To be specific on the gentleman's question, I don't have the background on that. I definitely will look at it. FEMA's goal is to expedite recovery in the most, in the quickest we can. We do have to do that, understanding that, eligible reimbursements are the key, or even that upfront money. We also have immediate needs funding process where we can do upfront grants. The state of Florida took advantage of that in Hurricane Michael. So, I'll definitely look at that. As far as the specifics of what the gentleman was asking, I don't have the projects in front of me.
Well, that might be one of the reforms we can make if you look at those programs that allow upfront funding, to see if there's something we could do to streamline that or make it work better, that'd be helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Norton?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Underlying the local matters that you've heard, Mr. Byard, is the overarching issue of climate change. In the last 5 years, FEMA has had to face $5 billion natural disasters. And not until this year has there been, and the House has passed some legislation. I'd be most interested to know whether climate change, Mr. Biden, is even on your agenda, and if so, what specific steps is FEMA taking to help states and local jurisdictions prepare for these redundant and increasingly costly climate change events?
Yes, ma'am. You know, FEMA's mission is very, very clear. We want to help people before, during, and after disasters. That's actually our mission statement. It's a pretty simple mission statement. What we're doing as far as individual communities is that's a decision of that community. We fund eligible mitigation projects that are pushed up by the community.
But I'm asking, there is an you're not responding to my question. Communities have not faced what the world understands to be climate change, a different and more repetitive, more serious events. I'm asking, is that on your agenda? I know what you do every day
Right.
when there is a disaster. Is climate change on FEMA's agenda? And if so, what are you doing with respect to climate change?
Yes, ma'am. And again, you know, FEMA doesn't guide what a local mitigation plan or a state mitigations plan is. It's based on the risk of that individual state or that individual community.
So you have no guidance whatsoever to offer?
No, ma'am. We have mitigation guidance. We have planning guidance. We have, you know, various amounts of tools and resources.
Has that planning and mitigation guidance changed since these natural disasters, billion-dollar disasters, have confronted FEMA, and since climate change has been a problem for the United States?
I can look back and see what changes, ma'am, have occurred, but, you know, flooding and different communities are faced with different threats. So, you know, again, that's part of the locally executed, state-managed, and federally supported program.
I thank you very much, but I take it from your answer that there is no national focus on climate change. Your answer does not assure me that we are preparing for these increasingly expensive events, or that we even understand them to flow from climate change. This is very serious, and I do hope that this committee will in fact instruct FEMA to notice and engage in these increasingly important preparation beyond the usual preparation for these increasingly costly events, so that the nation does have climate change on its agenda. Now, I do have another question. FEMA, we've heard over and over again from you and from members, is stretched thin. Sometimes you call upon employees from other agencies like Homeland Security. I'm not sure these other agencies have much background or the skills that are necessary. How do you deal with these employees that you have to borrow from other agencies? And I'd also like to know whether FEMA's new headquarters plan for Department of Homeland Security will help to fill in these gaps and assist FEMA and their staff when you're stretched thin like this.
Yes, ma'am. I have to say, you know, the program you're referring to is our surge capacity, our ability to do that, which was granted to the agency through legislation. It's tremendous. Let me say that. When you have federal partners that we can surge in first through the department, and then outside of the department they can do vital work like man our call centers for our survivors. The IRS does a great job when we call upon them to do that. to help with our disaster survival assistant teams to go out and actually face-to-face with the disaster survivors. Some of the feedback we get out of that is that it's some of the most rewarding work that our federal partners get to do. So that's a tremendous benefit to FEMA for that short term. As far as the FEMA headquarters, ma'am, I don't know, we're on 500 C Street. It's my understanding that we're staying on 500 C Street Southwest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. I think you make a good point. I don't see how you can possibly talk about resilience and mitigation without considering climate change. We'll now go to Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I want to thank you very much for having this hearing, and I wish that HUD were sitting here as well because they're very topical to this. I think it's awful that they've refused to attend today and afraid to attend, to be held to the standard, to be held accountable for their performance over the last several years. I want to very quickly address FEMA. In the initial drafts of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, we had a provision in there that incentivized state and local governments to carry out resilience activities. And in return, they would get a lower cost share from the 75-25 cost share on individual and public assistance programs. That was moved and it was enacted. We extracted it out of that bill and put it in the BBA 18, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. It's my understanding that FEMA has not taken any action in terms of implementing that program. Along the lines of what Ms. Holmes-Norton was just discussing, this incentivizes state and local communities to be more resilient, to adapt to changes in our climate and other flood risk and disaster risk challenges. I want to urge you, and I'd like for you to come back to this committee and let us know your implementation timeline. I've even heard some folks at FEMA secondhand say that they may not be implementing it. I'm not sure that when you read the law, it really gives you any discretion to do so. Number two, there's a provision in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that says that schools are to be, they're deductible. Schools in the aftermath of the disaster are to be adjusted. We are waiting on that. It's to the tune of about $40 million to schools in Louisiana. We have schools that are on opening. We have kids that are challenged as a result of this, and I want to urge you to please expedite that and please tell the committee when you're going to do that. Thirdly, and most importantly, in the GAO report that's largely topical of this hearing, GAO 19-232, page 47, you say in here that in a previous report, we found that different federal disaster response programs are initiated at different times, making it challenging for state and local officials to determine how to use federal funds in a comprehensive manner. It goes on to say, in response to a survey we conducted for the report, 12 of the 13 states and cities reported that navigating the multiple funding streams and various regulations is a challenge that affected their ability to maximize disaster resilience opportunities. So here you have, in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, FEMA comes in, and you start providing assistance. Then SBA comes in, then HUD comes in with the CDBG-DR grants. We had FEMA shutting down housing options in terms of hotels and mobile homes, yet HUD wasn't anywhere near the ability to come in and deliver the long-term recovery funds. So you had people sitting there in a gap for a year or more. It doesn't make sense. We look like a circus. We look like a bunch of clowns. This is all the same federal government. Now, the GAO report goes on and its conclusion, and it does not conclude that we need to take the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program and memorialize it. It doesn't say that. To the contrary, what it actually says is it says Congress should consider legislation establishing permanent statutory authority for a disaster assistance program administered by HUD or another agency that responds to unmet needs in a timely manner, directing the applicable agency to issue implementing regulations. And this report largely goes in and it says that HUD comes in each time and they issue they issue regulations. In terms of the BBA 18, it took HUD 18 months to issue regulations on how to tap the funds. 18 months to issue regulations. These are disaster victims that I don't think I've heard anybody talk about. These are disaster victims that have lost everything in many cases. We're the United States. This is ridiculous what we do to people. Our own federal government re-victimizes people. There should be seamless transitions. You know what? There's potentially going to be a bill next week on the House floor that's going to memorialize this Community Development Block Grant Program in the law. It's the stupidest thing we could possibly do. Let's take a look at the data. You just heard Mr. Alford say 79% of their grants are out the door. 79%. Is that what you said? 79%. You can look at this same report, page 77. You can look in here. You looked at grants, GAO, you looked at grants from 2012 and 2013. Do you know that 1/2 of the 50 grants, 1/2 of them from grants from 2012 and 2013 have hit the 79% mark? And we're going to memorialize this program. We have this program in Louisiana. We had a 1,000-year flood in 2016. We were given $1.7 billion. Of that, $1.2 is going to disaster victims. We had to pay a contractor $350 million to administer the program because of all the stupidity in the compliance and certification. That's $350 million that should be going to disaster victims. This is so stupid what we're doing. We're wasting money. $1.7 trillion is what we spent on disasters since 1980, just the top disasters. Congresswoman Plaskett and I have a bill, Congresswoman Fletcher and I have worked on this issue, trying to get this money out the door to disaster victims. We need to be very thoughtful with the clear evidence of how stupid it would be for us to go this HUD route. HUD's refusing to be here because they know they can't stand up to scrutiny. They would be embarrassed sitting in this room right now. We have got to go in a different path and learn from these clear lessons in the GAO report that screams it all over and over again. There's no reason it should take 18 months. These disasters regulations are nearly identical every time they issue them. This is embarrassing what we're doing to people. It's costing taxpayers money. It's unaffordable. And I'll say it again, we're re-victimizing disaster victims. Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Just to follow up on that, Mr. Curry, I asked you this earlier about the community grants and kind of where that program belongs to stay in HUD. Should it go to FEMA? Do they have the resources to?
Mr. Graves is absolutely right. The reason we didn't suggest it go to HUD is because it's Congress's decision how you want to fund the disaster grants. What we looked at was the problem, and the problem is that each time Congress appropriates money to HUD, it basically has to recreate the program and go through a federal regulation process, which is just not efficient.
Does, Mr. Bayer, does FEMA have the resources to take on this program?
Well, ma'am, as many of you have alluded to today, we're stretched thin. You know, we've got two major statutory programs that we administer based on law, the Public Assistance Individual Assistance Program. Well, the Congressman pointed out, there's no argument he's going to get from me. Our program ends in 18 months. Any assistance to eligible survivors for housing should overlap that because we have to start pulling out. But for FEMA to take on additional grant funding, I would say, you know, I would love to work with the committee about expanding our authorities to do, a different means of housing, but not to take on other agencies' responsibilities or grants.
Madam Chair, can I just ask 10 seconds, just one thing of you? Madam Chair, $350 million to administer this. We've got to look at the value added from the regulations, from all this scrutiny. This whole process assumes the fact that the states are going to spend the money stupidly and that they're going to be guilty and break the law. We've got to look at the value of that $350 million in our case and make sure that it's actually returning value to taxpayers. If we go from a 2% error rate to a 5% error rate by doing more of a block grant type scenario, okay, I'll take it all day long because we're going to get the money to disaster victims faster.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Ms. Plaskett, you want to add to this?
Thank you. I do want to add to this, and I want to ask you, sir, you said that FEMA is stretched thin, but if Congress not only gave you the authority, but also gave you the resources to do this, wouldn't this be a much more cohesive mechanism to be able to get, not just do the recovery, but the long-term rebuilding so that you're not duplicating efforts?
You know, ma'am, again, I would happily sit down with the committee and look at all the aspects of it. You know, I don't want to speak in terms of, what one solution may be because, you know, sometimes it's just not more people. It's a training aspect that's involved in that. It's other areas that are involved in that. Is FEMA a long-term agency? You know, I would make a case that we are a response agency and a short-term recovery
Well, that's not entirely what Congress has said that you're supposed to be when we changed the Stafford Act. For the U.S. Virgin Islands and for Puerto Rico, one of the things we said is that mitigation is necessary, and that we're doing your job better if we assist these areas to mitigate the damages so that when you come back in the next time, it's not just at the same level that you've had before. So we're looking at pre-positioning, right, for FEMA, because we know in the Virgin Islands, unfortunately, every year we play a hurricane prayer. It's part of our culture because we know that that's going to happen. And so these are things that we need to put in place. Now, I'm not knocking HUD whatsoever, but what I'm saying is that when we begin one process, end it, and then have to move to a different agency and begin again, then we have issues. For one of the things I wanted to bring up was you talked about capacity issues and cost estimates, right? Can you tell me how many cost estimates have been completed for the Virgin Islands and how many need to be completed for the fixed cost estimates that are, we have a March 20th, 2020 deadline? Do you know?
Ma'am, I'll get you the numbers. I know what we're focused on in the Virgin Islands. Oh, I'm sorry. Was it Chris or was you? Who?
No, I'm going to ask both of you.
Okay.
What's your thought?
What we're focused on the fixed cost estimates are those that apply with the Bipartisan Budget Act. And the beauty of that is, as well, as you know, is it allows us not to look at the pre-existing disaster conditions of that infrastructure.
Right, but how many of those cost estimates?
I can get you those numbers back.
Mr. Curry, are you aware of how many have been done and how many are still needed to be done, or a percentage?
So what we reported in our testimony is that there were 2 alternative procedures, long-term infrastructure cost estimates completed so far in the Virgin Islands. That doesn't mean that there's only been 2 projects, but
I know.
Yeah.
And out of how many do you know that they've said they're going to be doing?
I don't think the universe is actually known. I haven't seen an estimate on that.
Okay, and the date is, we have the estimate are due by March 2020, right?
Right.
March 20th, 2020 is a deadline, which is a concern to me because we have issues in which FEMA resources on the ground are, one, unfamiliar with building technologies and construction processes in the Virgin Islands. There are changes in personnel that occur on a regular basis, and those individuals need to be brought back up to speed as to what the last individuals who were in the Virgin Islands need to do. I mean, I'm not insensitive to the challenges of FEMA with multiple disasters around the country, but I do, of course, have to be concerned with the Virgin Islands, where September 2017 was the hurricane. We lost a major hospital in the Virgin Islands on the island of St. Croix, the only hospital. We still do not have a mobile unit for that hospital. We have one operating room. It's just deplorable when we talk about what individuals have to live through in dealing with this process and the need to streamline it. And so that's why I'm asking you about these cost estimates. Do you know if FEMA will be willing to devote more resources and personnel to site visits and more expeditious completion of the work it deems necessary? I know that you have a lot on the ground, but I don't think that you're at full capacity yet, are you?
We are, looking at how do we bring more local hires on board to help with that effort, because we know it's going to be a long-term effort. I understand where the deadline is, but we're committed to working with the territory to make sure that we get the fixed cost estimates done and the work moving. I think you hit on something, though. We understand that we have to have generators on the island pre-storm. We've done that now. We've learned a lot since 2017 about what are those critical things that we need on the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and all of our territories, for that matter. Yes, ma'am. I will commit to that. I'll speak with Jackie, who's running the operation.
She's been fantastic.
Yes, ma'am.
And the people that you have on the ground are really committed, and we're grateful for them being there. We just need more of them.
Yes, ma'am.
We need more people. And the other thing I wanted to mention, just quickly, wanted to get a question and answer on, is duplication of benefits. So in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, you have individuals that take out SBA loans, right? They need their homes repaired, they need it fixed, and so under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, we know that governors have the ability to request a waiver of the Stafford Act prohibition regarding duplication of federal benefits. So that's the question I'm asking, is that Are you in favor, and with the new provisions in federal law, so those who have taken out SBA loans right after a major disaster, some out of desperation, others in need to begin rebuilding right away. For most of us, the storms continued, hurricanes and rains continued for several months after that initial hurricane. Will they be able to use community development block grant funds they received to repay SBA loans? Will you allow our governors to be able to do that, request the waiver? Anyone?
Ma'am, I'm not familiar with the situation.
You're not familiar how individuals take SBA loans?
Oh, no, I am familiar with that, and actually, we have heard similar things. It's very confusing right after a disaster.
Right.
That they're actually getting a loan versus direct assistance.
Right.
I'm not familiar with how that would work under that scenario with CDBG HUD grants.
Mr. Baird, could you answer that quickly, and then we'll move on?
Thank you.
Ma'am, very similar to Chris, that would be a HUD, SBA, a question, ma'am. I don't.
Maybe somebody can get us, we'll look into it and get it back for the record. Just, we've heard a lot about FEMA staffing. What about Economic Development Administration staffing? Do you have enough people out in the field helping folks to go through the applications and grant process?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, unquestionably, the implementation of nearly 3 times of our regular appropriation has put a strain on staffing and EDA, and we've worked hard to fill that gap, but have had challenges doing so. And I think those challenges have come on multiple fronts. One, with a very strong economy, we're competing with not just other federal agencies, but the private sector for the key positions that we need. Particularly credentialed positions related to civil engineers and environmental compliance specialists and others. So we've worked hard to get those folks on board, but in many cases, we've fallen victim to them going into the private sector. We've also encountered some friction in regards to just the traditional administrative processes. Sometimes it takes longer than we would hope to get people through the federal hiring process. I guess I would note in that regard that unlike some of our sister federal agencies involved in disaster response and recovery, EDA has no special authorities related to hiring and bringing on staff to help with disaster response. So we're working through the traditional process. At this time, we've brought on board approximately 50% of the temporary hires that we've identified that we'll need to deploy the disaster recovery assistance.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think you can see some of the frustration of the members of this committee, and we're anxious to look at some reforms that we may do, streamlining the process, reorganizing possibly how to help with the personnel issues. So we ask you to continue to work with us as we move forward with some of these reforms. Are there any further questions from the
Madam Chairwoman,
Uh-huh.
I
Ms. Miller?
strongly suggest that FEMA stay to hear the witnesses from the second panel. I think it would be very helpful.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. At this point, then, we'll say thank you and ask the second panel to come forward.
Thank you all. I would now like to welcome our next panel of witnesses. Mr. Mike Sprayberry, Director of Emergency Management at the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, testifying on behalf of the National Emergency Management Association. The Honorable Fernando Gil Esnat, right? Secretary of the Department of Housing for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Ms. Rhonda Wiley, Administrator of Emergency Management, 911 and Floodplains for Atchison County, Missouri. And Mr. Reese C. May, Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at SBP. Thank you all for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. As with the previous panel, since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And Mr. Sprayberry, we will begin with you.
Chairwoman Fletcher and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for your kind introduction, for holding this hearing and allowing me to testify representing the National Emergency Management Association in the state of North Carolina. Since the devastation of Hurricane Matthew in 2016, North Carolina has experienced multiple hurricanes, tropical storms, and other disasters. Damage from Hurricane Florence alone totaled more than Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Floyd combined. We are also the only state where Hurricane Dorian made landfall earlier this year. Citizens across the country, as well as political leadership, must understand the roles and responsibilities in responding to and recovering from disasters. FEMA is not a first responder, and the governor maintains ultimate authority over managing the disaster. The 3 levels of disaster response, federal, state, and local, must all support one another. Our locals have a tough job. Many of them are only holding part-time positions, and few have all the necessary resources to respond to major events. To lead the state's efforts to rebuild smarter and stronger in the wake of Hurricane Florence, Governor Cooper established the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, or NCORE. The office provides many recovery functions, including managing CDBG-DR. With NCORE up and running, North Carolina is now on the road to recovery with a team of state, federal, and volunteer partners dedicated to helping communities rebuild to be more resilient and better prepared to weather future storms. One of the largest capability gaps currently is in the coordination of federal programs. In the wake of any disaster, state and local emergency managers may have to navigate more than 90 programs across 17 federal agencies. In my written statement, I go into detail about some of the challenges with disaster case management and crisis counseling programs at FEMA. Awards for these grants typically see significant delays. These delays lead to an inability to properly plan for assistance, maintain personnel, and commit resources to disaster survivors. FEMA recently announced the termination of the Sheltering in Temporary Essential Power, or STEP program, which enables residents to more quickly return to their homes. With the termination of the program, FEMA must work to leverage other existing programs for emergency sheltering and housing assistance to meet the needs of survivors. The continued debate over the National Flood Insurance Program and delays in implementing provisions of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act also prevent the bold moves we must take as a nation to be more resilient. No discussion of long-term recovery would be complete without addressing the CDBG-DR program at HUD. We appreciate the support of Congress in appropriating funds to CDBG-DR, and HUD has been a great partner to North Carolina in administering the program. However, the program remains bifurcated from other federal recovery programs, and the lack of a regular authorization leaves states waiting months, if not years, for funding. I know many options to this program are being discussed here in Congress, but one reform which would immediately improve CDBG-DR is creating a method by which information from disaster survivors could be shared across various federal agencies. Typically known as a universal application, this improvement would allow survivors to complete one application for use by HUD, FEMA, and the Small Business Administration. On behalf of the state emergency managers, thank you again for holding this hearing and drawing attention to the needs of the emergency management community. In North Carolina, we are acutely aware of the need to build upon the momentum of last year's Disaster Recovery Reform Act to further improve disaster recovery efforts and ensure we support our communities in their time of need. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Sprayberry. Mr. Gil Eisnot? I think you need to turn on your microphone, just push the
Sorry for
button.
that. I appreciate that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman Fletcher, and Mr. Grave. And on behalf of Governor Wanda Vasquez and Mr. Elmer Chavez, who is the head of the Puerto Rico Resiliency, Reconstruction, and Resiliency Center from now on, Court 3, and myself, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today. I would also like to thank Governor Vasquez for the trust she has placed in all of us and her team, and especially for the outstanding leadership we seek in she has put on for our recovery forward. So last but not least, I would like to recognize the commitment and effort of my coworkers at the Puerto Rico Department of Housing, the Court 3, and the government of Puerto Rico in general. Also our partners in HUD and FEMA, who have worked tirelessly for all Puerto Ricans. As you're aware, in September 2017, the devastating landfall of Hurricanes Irma and Maria caused an unprecedented damage to Puerto Rico housing stock, the economy, and our infrastructure, destroying the landscape of the islands for decades to come. So from this devastation, and due to the great work of this Congress and our resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colons, who I once again thank for all her work, funds were appropriated, granting Puerto Rico the resources it needed to recover itself from the devastation and a follow path to the economic development it deserves. Our governor's vision is for a successful recovery, relies on the synergies that the Court 3 and the Puerto Rico Department of Housing can create, working alongside each other, and a process, obviously, in this complicated process. As former prosecutor and attorney general, Governor Vasquez has committed all to the most transparent recovery in the nation and to ensure that American taxpayers' dollars are properly used and compliant with every rule and regulation. Court 3 primary focus is to work alongside FEMA to responsibly manage the permanent reconstruction work and stream of federal funding, while the Department of Housing is the grantee and main point of contact for HUD and manage the CBGDR funding. First, I'll address the progress in the CBGDR programs, and as you're aware, the HUD is the federal oversight agency of these dollars, and Congress has provided almost $20 billion in CDBG funding. Nonetheless, since the September 2017 appropriation, Congress made $1.5 billion that were available to Puerto Rico in February 2018. Unfortunately, we only have begun access to that initial 1.5, and so far, and we're waiting for almost 2 years after these other critical funds have been appropriated. Importantly, to this date, we have obligated almost $1 billion, and the response to our housing program has been predictably massive. We soon have applicants work through the eligibility process to exceed our initial $2.2 billion budget, and the notion that we are spending $1.5 billion slowly is simply inaccurate. Specifically, we're still waiting for the grant agreement for $8.2 billion of critical funding, and we are also waiting for the $8.3 billion mitigation notice, as well as the $1.9 billion for electrical grid purposes. Again, Congress has appropriated these dollars, but so far the administration has been slow to provide the funding. Nonetheless, our priorities for these are actually that we have to execute that grant agreement of $8.2 billion that it was previously announced in our action plan. We have to initiate the program design for the $8.3 billion of mitigation, understanding that the development of a mitigation needs assessment and the CBGDR mitigation action plans requires public participation and it takes time. And number 3, we have to continue to close partnership with federal partners and increase our expenditure ratio to ensure the lines of communications remain open and collaboratively. Now, on behalf of Governor Vasquez and Osmar Chavez, the FEMA panorama in Puerto Rico is being like that. From the $42.8 billion that were appropriated, only $20 billion obligated, $14.1 billion disbursed in all the jurisdictions. From that, 8.4 have been obligated in Puerto Rico, and 6.2 has been disbursed for PA and IA, nonetheless. Since Governor Vasquez came into become the governors, we have been able to lift the removal of Form OMB 270 in 45 days, and the small projects that is under $123,000, we have been looking for mechanisms to expedite the same. At the same time, we are waiting communication from FEMA from the second version of the Recovery Policy Implementation of Section 2601 of the BBA Act of 2018. This section will allow us in Section 406 of the PI procedures to be easily and to work hard, easily through the mainstreams of recovery. From that saying, from the 5 sectors that we have developed into our priorities, 3 priorities is to identify and mitigate areas of risk for the appropriate management and compliance of federal funds. We have a priority to identify bottlenecks in this process, and the 3rd priority is to identify solutions to enable a much delayed recovery and a meaningful begin starting with the rollout of the grid modernization programs. We have made significant progress in these past 60 days and from those three priorities that we developed. Nonetheless, since Harvey in 2017, permanent work or PWs of 15,221 has been obligated or made in all jurisdictions. Only 161 have been made in Puerto Rico. Let me say, Mr. Chairman, that despite our many challenges, our Puerto Rican fellow citizens and U.S. citizens are optimistic, we're determined, and our island, that is also your island, in the island of Enchantment, is full of potential. So on behalf of the $3.2 million Puerto Ricans, that live in the island, I would like to thank you for this opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ms. Wiley?
Thank you for that, ma'am.
Thank you for this opportunity to be here today and share with you all some of the difficulties of disaster recovery in rural America. When we as a nation take a blanket approach to how we respond to disasters. Flooding, such as what we are experiencing along the Missouri River, is historic and totally out of the box. Not all the disasters are the same, and we should be flexible in our responses to them as well. Putting arbitrary dates on a long-term flood actually jeopardizes a community's recovery from the disaster. We are still experiencing floodwaters in some areas through northwest Missouri, and it's impossible to put an ending date on a disaster that has not ended. March 16th was the first water rescue date, and the last was September 30th. However, FEMA's event dates for our disaster do not reflect this. It's the same flood, and we should be helping people with recovery, not trying to penny pinch by adding end dates to a flood that has not ended. How we approach mitigation also needs to change. U.S. Highway 136 was devastated by the flood of 2011, and so was U.S. Highway 159. Both have been underwater several times, and repairs have been made twice on US 59 just this year. It is currently underwater again. This is a continuous cycle of destruction, repair, destruction, repair. These U.S. highways are vital roadways to our communities and incurred damage in the same areas in 1993, 2011, and now in 2019. Why are we not leveraging mitigation programs to rebuild these roads with proper underflow and elevations that will prevent repetitive damage? We need FEMA to provide field staff that are empowered to help us find solutions and implement them. Simply placing a fact sheet on a website does not cut it. If we do not change how we respond to disasters such as long-term flooding, we will continue to watch taxpayer dollars wash away. Another example, the Corps of Engineers has spent approximately $22 million to temporarily repair 2 inlet breaches. While these breaches were very large and could be measured in yards, not miles, the cost to build a whole new levee system in the area north of US 136 is $35 million, according to the estimates I've received from our levee sponsors. Let me say this again. $22 million for a few hundred yards on a temporary repair, or $35 million on 7 miles that would strengthen the resilience of our county's critical transportation routes. Our levee sponsors and the Corps of Engineers both agree that setting the levee back and building a whole new system could be cheaper than repairs and would also protect lives and properties in Atchison County. For this to occur, it will take partnerships from various agencies at the federal, state, and local level to sort out the details, such as financing the purchase of ground to construct the new levee system. What I'm saying is, if we use common sense, we can actually protect lives, property, and save taxpayer money. As a floodplains administrator, it is my job to ensure that the citizens of our county are adhering to local floodplains ordinance. If their home is damaged greater than 50%, they cannot just go in, make the repairs back to what it was before the flood, and wait for the next flood to hit. As homeowners, they must mitigate according to NFIP rules. And yet, as public agencies, we do not adhere to this tried and true methodology of mitigation. I have to tell our citizens to do as we say and not as we do. Public agencies are wasting taxpayer money by building back as it was and waiting for the next round of floodwaters to inundate. We do not allow our citizens to do this with their personal properties. Why are we as government agencies not holding ourselves to the same standards? Again, I want to thank you all for this opportunity to be here today, and I will be happy to answer your questions as openly and honestly as I can.
Thank you. Mr. May?
Good afternoon, Representative Fletcher, Representative Gonzalez-Colon, Ranking Member Graves, and other members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to share some of the struggles that are facing vulnerable American communities who are still struggling to recover from disasters. My name is Reese May, and I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer for SBP. For the last 8 years, I've had the privilege of helping to build and lead an organization that's focused on the cessation of unnecessary human suffering wherever disasters occur. My organization is a nonprofit disaster preparedness and recovery group with the mission of reducing the time between disaster and recovery. We achieve that mission in a variety of ways. We prepare communities ahead of disasters. We build homes for survivors who are unable to afford market rate contractors. We share our best practices and resources with other organizations who serve the same. We advise state and local community leaders on the most efficient and effective practices in long-term recovery, and we advocate for federal policy changes that can positively impact recoveries around the country. Underlying all this work is a deep desire to prevent needless human suffering and fortify survivors against their breaking point. This notion is central to our work. We all have a breaking point. It's different for every individual, and after disasters, a survivor's breaking point is driven by 3 critical factors. First is time. Simply, how long does it take for a survivor to make a full recovery? Second is predictability. Do survivors have a clear path forward, or are they staring into an abyss of uncertainty? Third is access to resources. Can survivors access the resources they need, public or private, to make a full recovery and to survive while doing so? Beyond the breaking point, individuals lose their ability to focus on work, care for their families, be present for their lives. Families simply lose hope. Over the last 8 years in communities across the country, I've personally seen this hopelessness manifest as domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse. I've seen hardworking Americans who achieve the dream of home ownership lose it all because they were unable to suffer the delay and unpredictability that is seemingly built into America's system for disaster recovery. Impacted Americans on SBP's waiting list have died in wait for federal assistance that simply didn't make it in time. At this point, I've spent as much time working on U.S. disaster recovery as I spent as a United States Marine. I'm not certain of many things, but one is this: the successful reform of our nation's framework for disaster recovery is more important to America and to Americans than anything I did on either of my tours in Iraq. The written testimony I've submitted shares much more about our organization and the human stories that animate our work each day. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. However, in my remaining time, I'd like to make 3 specific recommendations about how we can improve disaster recovery in America. First, as Mr. Sprayberry mentioned, we can create a single application for federal assistance. Presently, disaster survivors must fill out a FEMA application where they're sometimes denied and referred to SBA for a loan that they may or may not be eligible for. Few understand that one must apply for the loan and be rejected in order to receive additional assistance from FEMA. Many families are dejected after denials and simply give up, potentially affecting their eligibility for HUD assistance that will arrive years later. Solution is to create a single application for federal assistance such that homeowners apply once and can be qualified for all forms of assistance. Second, FEMA must improve its damage assessment methods. Presently, FEMA's primary means of assessing damage to homes is to send individual inspectors to houses one at a time with paper and pen or tablet devices to adjust damages. This method is slow, inconsistent, often inaccurate, and it's subject to human error and human bias. Meanwhile, the insurance industry and other private actors use drones, satellite imagery, traditional flyovers, and predictive analytics to adjust and pay claims far more quickly.
In Florida, after Hurricane Michael, SPP conducted analysis using FEMA individual assistance data and aerial imagery obtained from a third-party source to compare individual awards to the level of actual home damages that we could see in the images. Local officials in one community convinced FEMA to reassess 7 homes. 5 of those received additional assistance of more than $3,000 on appeal, and 1 increased from $1,100 to $34,000. Of the 2,400 properties we reviewed, we believe that another 200 Floridians are in a similar position. Imagine the impact of this technology at scale in disaster-impacted areas across the country. And finally, though I will run over my time, we must form public and private partnerships to accelerate recovery efforts. As it stands, though I tend to agree with Representative Graves, HUD CDBG-DR assistance is the greatest potential source of funds for low and moderate income families who need to make a full long-term recovery. But these funds are neither prompt nor predictable. Congress appropriates, then HUD publishes a federal register outlining the rules for use. State and local governments write action plans and submit to HUD for review and eventual approval. Only then are disbursements made to state and local governments who begin a procurement and contracting process to hire contract teams who take still more time to ramp up and achieve scale. The end result is that programs often take 6 years or more to reach the majority of applicants, leaving aside those eligible applicants who fall through the cracks or those who simply walk away from the program because they can't deal with any more delay or despair. I'd ask this committee to think of your constituents, families who are current on their mortgage, they pay their taxes, they didn't live in a flood zone and so weren't required to have flood insurance, now need to fund by themselves a $35,000 or more home repair and suffer a 6-year delay being reimbursed by the federal government. These are the families that SPP helps every day. They're eligible for assistance and they desperately need it. They simply cannot wait. I believe that we can build something like the Recovery Acceleration Fund, a public-private partnership where charitable funds and social impact capital can be used to rebuild homes for qualified applicants quickly and for less cost after disasters. Those funds can be reimbursed later when HUD funds eventually make it to communities. If you pair this with opportunity zones, the possibilities are truly endless. These are a few of the ideas that we believe could create more resources and make recovery faster and more predictable, ensuring that fewer Americans are pushed beyond their breaking point. These improvements could bring recovery outcomes in line with American values and prevent significant human suffering in the process. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share some of these ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. May, and thanks to all of you for your testimony this morning. I look forward to hearing your answers to the questions from the members. And we're now going to move on to the member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. And I will start by recognizing myself. I appreciate that you all were here during the first panel and heard some of the questions, and I think this is a nice transition to talk about your experiences in dealing with so many different agencies. I know, Mr. Sprayberry, that you addressed the challenge of dealing with so many agencies at once in facing all the other challenges during a disaster. And so I'm interested to hear more about your perspective on guiding your state through the FEMA recovery and then transitioning to the HUD process and the CDBG-DR funds. And if you could talk about, I guess, where you see room for improvement and whether that process is seamless, as has been suggested, or whether we should be rethinking how we do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would just first say that the process is not seamless. And I will say that the new PA process that FEMA has rolled out has begun to mature. Our project worksheets are starting to move faster. We send them to Denton, Texas, where they have a consolidated resource center. That's working pretty well. Individual assistance is working pretty well too. We are concerned about the STEP program being taken out of the inventory because that allows families to stay in their own homes while they look forward to more permanent repairs. I will say that CDBG-DR has proven to be problematic for us. It was a challenge because we didn't have any experience since the early 2000s, and then at there was a much lower amount of funding. Our first allocation was $236.5 million. We are now finally on pace. But the real problem is, I think, is that, it's not authorized, and you have to wait, every time that there's an allocation, there's an appropriation made in Congress, and then there's a press release which heightens the expectations of everybody in the state. We're going to be getting this money, and it's going to be quick. And then we wait. It goes silent until we get the Federal Register. And I think what's happening with the folks up at HUD, you've got folks that are, as Congressman Graves said earlier, that, that doesn't change that much, the Federal Register. So what they're doing is they're spending an inordinate amount of time writing these Federal Registers when they could just put them on out there. And let's take a look at, the rules for state action plans too. So we need to compress the time frame. I don't think that we need to move it to another agency. I think HUD's the right place for it. There's a lot of other housing programs there that they can leverage, and I also think that if we think moving it to someplace like FEMA, who is still developing policies for the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, they're still a year out from that and still haven't gotten all those policies out, which are laws. There's some issues there. So a lot of room for improvements for CDBG-DR, and what's helped us out is we created an office that can handle all that called North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency.
Thank you, Mr. Sprayberry. And I think all of you can probably talk to this. Certainly, Mr. May, I think your comments touched on it as well as all of the witnesses. But as I mentioned in the last hearing, what I hear from my constituents who waited 2 years for the publication of the rules following Hurricane Harvey and the 2018 appropriations is a real frustration for the individuals going through the recovery, dealing with all these different agencies, understanding the rules. So what suggestions do you have on how we can turn this into a more sort of victim-centric focus? We talk a lot in healthcare about having patient-centered care. That is the center of the universe. So do you have ideas or suggestions for us of things we can do to streamline that process, both at the level for the agencies, for the state and local authorities, but also for the individuals? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the time we have left.
One of the things that my organization does is encourage folks who are in risky areas to understand what may be required of them if they are affected. And so what we've heard from a lot of our clients is that the collection and documentation issues around proving home ownership and damage to their home is something that they often struggle with. My organization has put together a ton of training and preparedness materials that can help homeowners understand what steps they should take in advance of disasters to be better prepared and to more forcefully advocate for themselves through these various application processes after disasters occur.
Thank you. Ms. Willie, you want to weigh in?
I agree with Mr. May. The application process is so extensive, and our victims sometimes just get lost in this red tape. And if we could eliminate that and make a one application process, as he spoke of, for all the federal agencies in order to find what they actually qualified for, it would actually be a huge improvement, and I believe less people would be lost in the cracks.
Thank you very much. I have gone over my time, but I anticipate there'll be a lot of other great questions. And for the next round of questions, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mentioned in my opening statement and my questions for Ms. Wiley, I mentioned the resilience and the attitude that we have seen, with people, just picking themselves up and trying to move on as best they can. And if you could, can you talk to me or talk to the committee just a little bit about, I guess if there is a win out of this, it's watching what people are capable of and what they've had to go through?
Absolutely. Our biggest win is that nobody's died from this horrific flood. We have been able to get everybody out early through evacuation process and in areas that have never evacuated before. People have always refused to evacuate. They've stayed there in previous floods. So this time we were able to get everybody out. And when nobody has died, to me, that is the biggest win of all. Another win would be our disaster recovery fairs. As you guys know, because of the difficulties associated with preliminary damage assessments, we are unable to bring in assistance such as the multi-agency resource centers and disaster recovery centers, because you can't do preliminary damage assessments if these areas are still underwater. As Mr. May had mentioned in his testimonies about utilizing resources, modern technology such as drones would be very helpful. But what we did with that, because we had so many individuals that needed assistance now, they had questions that needed answers, we spun up our long-term disaster recovery team, and we called them the short-term disaster recovery team and put them to work. And we organized our own disaster recovery fairs and had BOADs and COADs and everybody show up just like they would at a multi-agency resource center or at for the disaster recovery centers too. And it worked very well. Our first one had over 200 families that showed up and serviced in Atchison County. Our second one we did was in Holt County because our long-term disaster recovery teams consist of 2 counties. And so our second one we had in Holt County, and it was also a win, and we had over 100 families show up to that. In such small populated areas, those are huge wins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank also the ranking member, Mr. Graves, and the other Mr. Graves, for helping in many of the issues regarding Puerto Rico during the last 2 years, and the visit of Mr. Graves to Puerto Rico to discuss this issue. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming here, and I truly understand the hardships. We managed to get the federal funds that are being approved by Congress, but sometimes the red tape in some agencies and the bureaucracy just deflect the sense of urgency that our communities need to solve these issues. And this is something that not just this committee, several other committees are discussing. And the reason I'm just right here, right now, we were in Natural Resources Committee having this kind of the same discussion with the fiscal situation on the island and the PROMESA board with several witnesses in different committees. So sorry about not being at the same time, but being the only member representing Puerto Rican Congress to represent 3.2 million American citizens instead of having 4 members and 2 senators make a difference when issues regarding our island are discussed. Having said that, I do have questions to Mr. Hill, which is our Secretary of Housing in Puerto Rico. And one of the main issues we've been seeing during the last 2 years, our Congress approved more federal funding to Puerto Rico than any other administration, never before. Never before Puerto Rico received so much funding from FEMA, from HUD, and many other federal agencies. And it was approved in the House, approved in the Senate, the President signed all those bills, but sometimes you feel that the publication of the guidelines in the Federal Register are not being done in time. Actually, the HUD administration admitted to Congress and several committees that they missed the deadline of October to actually make that publication available. If we don't have the publication available, you can manage and propose a plan to use the CDBG-DR funds. So having said that, my main question will be to you is, what is needed? What is the delay, and how we can overcome the delay for signing a public partnership agreement between HUD and local House Department for the $8 billion in CDBG-DR funds?
Real quick, Madam Chair, I might point out too that the gentlelady represents Puerto Rico, which is no stranger to disasters.
Thank you, Representative Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon. But on our behalf, and the things that we can control at the state level or at the island level, is that to put all the action plans in place, to put like every guideline in place, and let like obviously HUD to approve the same or not approve it. In that regard, HUD has approved 2 plans totaling $9.7 billion. The second part, or the $8.2 billion plan that was approved, we're pending the grant agreement from it. It has been already almost 200 days or more since the approval of that plan, taking into consideration the first plan.
Was this a justification for a delay?
In all honesty, we don't know. I mean, it's something that HUD hasn't provided, like the grant agreement for us to sign.
Do you have a timeline on
We
when
don't.
that
They
that's
haven't
happening?
expressed the same, and we actually don't know like a specific
So
timeframe for
if
it.
you don't have that plan approved or signed by the HUD administration, what are the programs, what are the services that are put on hold in the island?
Well,
One, two, three.
Right now, we are serving and we're taking applications from the housing program. And if we don't receive that funding, a lot of the people that has already been submitting their application, maybe they cannot be 10 because obviously we don't have the money for it. So that tranche of 8.2 and the signature is really important to continue our services.
One of the issues is that the first tranche of funds from HUD was approved and disbursed to the island. It was $1.5 billion. So some people said that the government of Puerto Rico has not spent that money yet, and that's the reason they're holding money. I mean, you agree on that?
Well, technically, it's a misconception in the sense of like we have already like made an obligation of $1 billion almost, and in that regard, it takes time to spend it. Nonetheless, we have spent that $1.3 billion, for example, on our STEP program, where we manage where we basically repair more than 108,000 homes. And we have the capacity to do it. I mean, like we have augmented our to more than 85 people, plus the consultants that we have, that they're all on a performance-based contract and milestone-based on it. So giving that capacity to our people, and in that regard, I mean, like it's just a matter of us putting the work that we're putting in, but we need the cooperation from HUD to basically do their part and give us like that grant agreement.
The September 4 deadline for disbursement of mitigation funds under CDBG-DR program were missed several times by HUD. At the same time, how long it would take you to prepare and publish the required action plan by Vivienda once the guidelines are published? How long it would take?
Well, they usually provide 90 days, and then they have like 40 days to revise the same and approve the same. So basically, we're expecting a 90 days preparation time for it, and we just co-dependent on the notice and what are like basically the framework for us to prepare that action plan.
I know my time is expired, but I want to say thank you to all the witnesses because I do have several questions to all of you. I will submit them for the record as well. But in our case, having the funds being approved but not disbursed is creating a biggest hardship to many Puerto Ricans on the island and to the whole recovery process. I mean, how we can expedite that, not just in the funds in Vivienda or HUD, the CDBG-DRs, and how a federal monitor to HUD in Puerto Rico, to Vivienda in Puerto Rico is going to work. That's some of the questions that will remain unanswered. Thank you, and I'll give back.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and great to see our witnesses here today. Appreciate you being here. Dr. Sprayberry, you and I know each other real well. We've been through a number of storms together, and it seems like every year it's a new storm, a new day, which leads me to comment. I think you mentioned, the press releases, and I've seen the press releases, of course, in Congress, and in fact, have been part of some of those press releases. When Congress appropriates money, and I can tell you that those of us who sign our names to those had no expectation whatsoever that it would take 3 years in some cases to get this money out the door and to the recipients. Can you talk just briefly about how that hinders the recovery effort, particularly in years when you have successive storms? For example, we had Florence in 2018, a year ago. We were looking at Dorian coming right on through and really socking us in the nose as well this year. Thankfully, it stayed off the coast. And one of the thoughts I had, you've got all those homes, all those people that are still out of their homes, dislocated. not enough contractors to go around to repair their roofs, and, you know, just imagine what a Category 5 is going to do. You know, somebody doesn't have their roof repaired completely because they can't find a contractor. Well, that storm comes through and, you know, it does that much more damage. Can you talk about the residual effect, the compounding effect of the lack of disaster funding that you need?
Thank you for that question, sir, and good to see you as well. I would say that, as you know, when we first got the funding for Hurricane Matthew, we didn't have the capacity and we had to build from scratch, and we have since remedied that with our NCOR office. I would tell you that team at NCOR is that whenever the storms actually happen, the storm blows out, we continue to march. And so the idea is that no matter if you have successive storms that are affecting additional households, we're continuing to be decisively engaged with the funding that we have for Hurricane Matthew. As you know, sir, we're still waiting for the mitigation funding. There's been a FR for that. We intend to turn in our state action plan to HUD in December. And then we're still waiting for the $336.5 million for Florence, and then whatever we're going to get in the disaster supplemental bill later on after that. What I'm telling you here, sir, is we've got a structure now that's where we can drop the funding into the structure and it continue to move. We're not slowing down at all. We've got contractors on the ground. We're building. As you know, we've added a couple of counties, Bladen and Columbus County, and so we have 6 most impacted and distressed from Matthew. We think we know which ones are going to be the counties, the mid-counties for Florence. So I would also like to say that we've got the opportunity working with our hazard mitigation section and the NCOR section. We're able to crosswalk all the different projects for all the homeowners and decide which buyout is best for which program. And so we're able to reach and help more folks. We've got about 3,000 households right now that we're working with on buyouts, elevations, demolition, rebuilds. So we're able to leverage that and leverage those efficiencies between the 2 sections. And so that's kind of where we are right now. We have a chief resilience officer that's making sure that as we rebuild and recover, that everything has a core of resiliency, because we don't want to rebuild the same old way and get hit the same old way.
In my remaining time here, the 40 seconds I have left, let me ask you this hypothetical. Suppose we did a block grant to the state, whether it's through HUD, through FEMA, or whatever. What are 3 points of guidance that would be helpful to you? Forget about what we have now, because there's a bunch of us that are highly frustrated with the system we have now. Give me, and you may want to think about it some and come back to me later, each of you, but give me 3 points of guidance that you would need in order to make that work. We block grant the money, you handle it. Obviously, got to have a little accountability. What are 3 things that would help you?
So we'd like to have more flexibility on duplication of benefit. Would like to have a universal application. And let me think about a 3rd one, sir.
Like a single point, like, or inspections, instead of doing multiple inspections for damage in a house. I mean, like, they run like probably 2 or 3 with different sets of regulations for it, instead of being 1 inspection.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. I have a quick follow-up question, then I'm going to open it up in case any of the members still present have any further questions. But very briefly, Mr. May, in your testimony, you mentioned the idea of a public-private partnership model to possibly accelerate disaster recovery efforts. Can you both explain how you think that could work, and also whether there's anything preventing that from working now?
Thank you for that question. So the way we imagine it working is that you could take charitable funding from major foundations who have sort of mission, obligation to give after major disasters. You could pair that with social impact capital and private funds that investors may contribute to a fund. You would then qualify homeowners per the guidance that HUD uses to qualify families for CDBG-DR assistance in disasters for the last 30 years. So folks who own their home, they don't own other homes, they can't afford market rate contractors, they want to stay in their community, they make 80 to 120% of AMI or less. You then use this private funding to rebuild their homes more quickly. We think this will certainly reduce human suffering in getting folks back into their houses more quickly, not staying in hotels for 30 days at a time and wondering if their temporary housing assistance will be re-upped in the 11th hour. But secondly, we think it will be a reduction in total taxpayer expense. You don't have to look very far in North Carolina to find the dilapidation that occurs when homes aren't repaired quickly. And that's not just a knock on North Carolina, Mike. That's, you look in Mississippi, Louisiana, Ms. Fletcher, in your district, when homes aren't repaired quickly, it becomes more costly to repair them in the long term. So presently, to the second part of your question, do we think there's anything that prevents it now? The short answer is no. Perhaps a little regulatory clarification that would help us attract additional investment, and that would sort of warm the marketplace for clients who may be hesitant or unwilling to engage in a lending relationship with a nonprofit organization like ours. But presently, after disasters, those who can afford to self-fund their own repairs using their money or family money, there exist reimbursement pathways both in the city of Houston and through the General Land Office in Texas for those expenses to be reimbursed. The trick is when low and moderate income families who don't have liquidity need to obtain that funding from somewhere else, the reimbursement pathway doesn't work for them. And so we think that with a bit of regulatory clarification and perhaps a few well-placed questions to HUD, we could clear that up and begin to do this at scale in disaster-impacted communities right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. May. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, did you have an additional question?
I definitely have an additional question, and that will be, we do have a lot of vendors on the island that are, and this is for Mr. Hill, we do have a lot of vendors on the island that have been working in the recovery process, but if you can't pay them, some of them will not be available to finish major projects. So that's one of the concerns. The second will be in terms of HUD administration has consecutively stated that they got a good relationship, working relationship with you, but naming a federal monitor, how that may affect or delay receiving the funds. Some municipalities are used to work with CDBG funds, regular CDBG funds. In the past, actually, they are certified to work with them, but at this time, they're not certified to have direct, be receivers directly from HUD department about those funds. So my question at this time will be, that announcement of appointment of a federal monitor to oversee the disbursement of funds, CDBG-DR, and Vivienda, that will help, that will delay the funds? What's the excuse for that?
Congresswoman, in all honesty, we haven't seen like any type of draft framework or type of regulation that we'll use for that monitor. We hope that it helps, but we don't know if it's more bureaucracy on it that will delay the funding. And until we don't know that, I mean, like, I cannot give you an honest answer about it. Nonetheless, we're ready. We're able to basically comply with everything. We have like a robust set of rules, guidelines, SOPs in order to handle these monies. And I know for in terms of like the payments for municipality, Core 3 has already paid almost $100 million in the last 18 months to those vendors. And I think at the end of the year, another 200 will be done. Nonetheless, if we go into what the permanent work has been delivered, we only see like only $34 million from that deliverance, and basically from the $6.2 billion that have been paid in IA and PA, we're paying $300 million at the end of the year. So,
what are the roadblocks for the lack of guidance from HUD in terms of for you to actually disburse the funds and invest those?
Well, we go along the lines after obviously after the appropriations of those monies and the regulations has said, like it comes a little bit arbitrary on behalf of HUD saying which can go and which cannot. I believe on the framework and a base law and a law that basically provide that framework for you to go on and speed up. And it will help us actually on the future also too, if we have like off-the-shelf housing programs for every disaster, because in every disaster we have obviously housing problems, so we can have off-the-shelf programs that basically can regulate that. But since from disaster to disaster, the notice changes, the rules changes, I mean, it's really complicated to pinpoint and specific into it.
Just before yielding, you make a difference between the small projects and the big projects. And we do share that vision with you. I mean, having a lot more than 100,000 small projects going out directly when they are from $100,000 or less. How can we improve that? Can you make a recommendation, maybe not now, but in writing opinion to the committee on how to expedite those small projects to go out when they should not be complying with the same requirements of the big projects on the island?
And that's basically what happened in Puerto Rico for more than a year after we adopted the 428 process, in which basically all the projects, small projects being $123,000 or less, being treated at the same level as $20 or $30 million projects. Now, obviously, that creates a bottleneck. In the future, we have to basically let our authorized professionals also to do a damage assessment, to expedite those damage assessments, for FEMA actually, to recognize them and basically honor them, and that will expedite the whole process on it.
With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rouser, you have an additional question?
Yes, I want to go back to my last question. The clock was running down and ran out of time there, and each of you lit up in your own way when I asked that. So I want to give you an opportunity to address it further if any of you had any additional comments. And basically, that was, this. If we do a block grant, whether it's through HUD or through FEMA, forget about what we have in place now. What are 3 points of guidance that would be really important to you? I got the notes of what a few of you said, but some of you seem to have some additional thoughts, and I want to give you time.
Yes, sir. Thank you for an opportunity to comment. I would add and build upon the point I was making earlier that I think, Mr. Sprayberry mentioned flexibility around duplication benefits. I think that matters. A simplified application that qualifies disaster survivors for every form of available assistance is crucial. And building on my earlier point, the ability to repay self-funded repairs. We have hardworking American families out there that do the right thing. They fix their homes right after disasters. They liquidate assets. They create cash in order to do this. And to the extent that they're eligible for the block funding that you have hypothetically put out there, I think an ability to repay those families who made the right decision or who found a way to materialize resources to make those repairs, I think is crucial. Thank you.
Well, I'll add like the inspection part of it, but also like the flexibility in the expenditures and the flexibility also and a pre-approved or pre-given procurement policy into it. 70% of the money that is waste is basically waste, federal money is waste on procurement. So we standardize that, and we standardize for all the jurisdiction. That will take away basically a 70% out of waste. So that will be like that plus what Mr. Sprayberry said on a unification of all the information and being able to gather that from it.
Anyone else?
Additional?
Okay.
Mr. Sprayberry, you have something?
Allow the feds to delegate certain approvals to the state as well, so we can, request certain things, and there's some flexibility there.
Yeah. Let me ask this, and as my final question, through the process with the current system, list for me anything that, and for the committee as well, anything that you thought to yourself, this really, other than what you've just outlined, anything that you thought, this really just does not make a whole lot of sense. Or we've done this one gazillion times, like when you go in the emergency room and they have you fill out all this paperwork in this room, and that room, and you think, well, my gosh, I just filled all this out. Why do I have to do it again? List things of that nature so that I can learn more.
Well, sir, as I mentioned, the Federal Registers come out. They don't, with the exception of the new one that we have for CDBG MIT, they don't change dramatically. I'm pretty sure they can figure out which counties are most impacted and distressed, pretty quick because they have the data. So what is the problem? Why does it take so long to have, these Federal Registers, they take so long, and then, and then we're given, it's like a slow dance or something, it takes a long time for them to get out. then you do your state action plan, and it's back and forth. And so that really just we need to compress the timeline. I mean, that's what's happening. That's why there's a gap in housing for folks that are getting the individual assistance. We know that CDBG-DR is the last grant for people, for disaster survivors, but being the last grant shouldn't mean 2 years down the road. It should be a lot quicker. We know 18 months is what we have IA, individual assistance for, so that's, getting that done, reducing requirements for state action plan. We've talked about environmental assessments before. We use one environmental assessment for all federal agencies. They should hold to that. And start implementing some of the plans. I think that they should do that, and we can start. HUD is the place. I don't want to say that if we're going to still keep it with a federal agency, but you're talking about something different, which would be a block grant that would go direct to the state. Is that correct, sir?
That's, in my perfect world, that's how I would do it, yes. But I'm trying to understand the whole scope here. Thank you.
Right.
My time's expired.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. And now I will recognize Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Sprayberry, as of 2 years after Hurricane Matthew, and I think we're now right at 3 years after Hurricane Matthew, one of the issues there was that there were millions of dollars of relief funding that had not gotten to residents from North Carolina. Is that still the case?
Sir, we're now on pace. We've drawn down $27.3 million and have $142.8 million committed. So we've made some significant progress. It's not where we want to be. We want to have all that money out to disaster survivors.
But that's 27 million out of over 150 million?
236.5 million.
236, so.
Yes, sir.
And how much do you still have to?
So I would say.
Simple math would be 27 million from 236 would be 209 million. 3 years after a disaster. I don't know about my colleague from North Carolina, but I can't understand why 3 years after a disaster, we're still sitting on over $200 million when there are people in desperate need for it.
That's a great point, sir. And I would tell you that when the money was awarded to us, we didn't have the capacity to basically execute the grant. We didn't have anybody that was trained and that knew how to do it. We changed that now with the stand-up of the new North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency with 45 highly trained individuals, and we're able to manage the grant more efficiently and get the money out the door to disaster survivors.
You've had another storm since then, not nearly the impact with Matthew, but again, you just told me you're sitting on $209 million. What's the timeline? I mean, and I'd love to know what the holdup is, because if the money's under the control of the state of North Carolina, I mean, are there still federal regulations that are tying your hands?
No, I would say that we are working with all the projects to get them out and making sure that we're fully meeting all the eligibility criteria. We've been hit by Matthew, which was our storm of record, then by Florence, which is our new storm of record, to be followed by Michael and now Dorian. So a lot of different funding pots and a lot of money going out there. We haven't received the $168 million in mitigation yet. We haven't received the $336 million in Florence money. So we're still working with the Matthew money, and so we're totally focused on that and totally focused on not only just assisting with reconstructions and rehabilitations, but also expanding our portfolio of affordable housing.
Has any of that money been spent on anything other than relief for Hurricane Matthew?
It's Hurricane Matthew only, sir.
Okay, but you're waiting on funding for these other hurricanes, Florence, Michael, and Dorian. And Madam Chairman, this is something that really bothers me, is that we fund these projects, the money doesn't get spent, another storm hits, we appropriate more money, and we don't know yet what's been done to mitigate and provide relief from the previous storms. And it sounds like we're piling money on top of money. So I think this might be something we want to take a deeper dive into a little bit later on. I'm not satisfied with the answers that I'm getting. I mean, 3 years after a storm, and there's still over $200 million that hasn't been spent, and there's requests for more money. And this is not just a North Carolina problem. This is going on in other places as well. On that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. It's now time to close the hearing. And so I want to take a minute to thank each of the witnesses for coming and testifying today. Your testimony has been incredibly helpful to us as we work on the issues that we've been discussing. So it's very informative and helpful. I thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.